In the late 19th century, the North Atlantic remained a corridor of constant movement, where merchant brigs crossed between ports under conditions that were often predictable only in their uncertainty. The Resolven was one such vessel, a small trading brig operating routine routes through waters shaped by shifting weather systems, heavy seas, and long stretches of isolation far from immediate contact with land. When it was later found adrift, intact yet abandoned, the surrounding ocean offered no immediate explanation for what had interrupted its passage. What follows draws from fragmented maritime records, salvage accounts, and the limited testimony preserved from the crew who were recovered alive but offered no consistent account of what occurred aboard the ship. You're taken through the documented timeline of the voyage, the recovery of the vessel, and the investigation that followed, where every piece of evidence points toward an event that was witnessed but never properly recorded. The vessel that should have been empty. The North Atlantic carried a reputation long before modern maps reduced its emptiness to lines and coordinates. During the 19th century, the sea between the coasts of Britain and the wider Atlantic trade routes remained a place where weather could erase certainty within hours, where thick fog banks drifted without warning across shipping lanes, and where hundreds of small commercial vessels moved through cold water with little protection beyond timber hulls, canvas sails, and the judgment of their crews. Merchant brigs crossed these waters constantly, carrying coal, timber, limestone, grain, and manufactured cargo between ports that depended upon maritime trade for survival. Most voyages vanished into routine. Ships departed, cargo arrived, and another crossing began. Yet scattered among shipping records and newspaper archives were incidents that refused to settle into ordinary explanations, stories that endured precisely because the facts surrounding them appeared incomplete. Among them was the strange case of the brig Resolven, a vessel that should have become another abandoned ghost ship drifting through Atlantic waters, but instead revealed something far more unsettling when rescuers discovered that its crew was still alive. The Resolven was a Welsh merchant brig registered during the late 19th century, operating at a time when sail-powered commerce still survived, alongside the growing dominance of steamships. Vessels of its class were neither luxurious nor especially large, but they formed an essential part of coastal and transatlantic trade. Brigs were built for efficiency rather than comfort, carrying two square-rigged masts capable of handling shifting Atlantic winds while maintaining enough cargo space to remain profitable. Life aboard such ships was physically exhausting and often dangerous, particularly during winter crossings when freezing spray-coated decks with ice and storms could damage sails faster than exhausted sailors could repair them. Crews were typically small, sometimes consisting of fewer than 10 men, each responsible for constant labour regardless of weather or exhaustion. The maritime world of the 1880s remained deeply dependent upon discipline and routine because survival often depended on repetition. Sailors climbed rigging in darkness, navigated using chronometers and sextants beneath cloud-covered skies, and spent weeks surrounded by nothing except grey water and shifting weather fronts. Conditions below deck were cramped and damp, lit by weak lantern light and filled with the smell of salt water, rope fibres, wet wood, and cargo packed tightly into narrow storage compartments. Merchant crews were accustomed to discomfort, but they were also familiar with danger in all its recognisable forms. Storms could be anticipated, mechanical failures could be repaired, even disease and injury followed patterns sailors understood. The sea was feared because it was unpredictable, yet its dangers remained visible enough to be confronted directly. That understanding became important in the case of the Resolven because the terror later associated with the vessel did not resemble ordinary maritime fear. In August 1884, the Resolven departed from Cardiff, Wales, beginning what should have been another uneventful commercial voyage across the Atlantic trade routes. Historical accounts surrounding the ship vary slightly depending on the surviving newspaper reports and maritime summaries, but the brig is generally believed to have been bound toward Canada, carrying a cargo of timber or other commercial goods typical of Welsh merchant traffic during the period. Its captain was John James, an experienced mariner familiar with Atlantic crossings and the risks that accompanied them. Nothing recorded about the voyage initially suggested catastrophe. Weather reports from the North Atlantic that season described shifting conditions, but nothing extraordinary enough to immediately explain what would later unfold aboard the vessel. Days later, somewhere off the coast near Newfoundland, another ship encountered the Resolven drifting strangely across cold Atlantic waters. At first glance, the sight appeared familiar enough to experienced sailors. ships occasionally lost steering capability, suffered damaged rigging, or drifted after storms. Abandoned vessels were not unknown in 19th century maritime history either. Throughout the Atlantic, there existed countless stories of ships discovered empty, meals still resting on tables, or lamps still burning beside deserted cabins. Such discoveries fascinated the public because they implied sudden disappearance, as though entire crews had been erased from existence between one moment and the next. The sea produced mysteries capable of surviving for generations precisely because so few witnesses ever returned from them. The Resolven seemed poised to become one of those stories. Reports from the boarding party described the brig as damaged but still afloat, drifting without proper control yet not destroyed. Parts of its rigging were reportedly compromised, and sections of the vessel showed signs of heavy weather, but the ship itself remained seaworthy enough to stay above water. More importantly, there was no immediate sign of mass death aboard the vessel. No evidence suggested violent struggle on deck. No reports described bloodshed or visible wreckage consistent with catastrophic collision. Instead, something far stranger emerged when the rescuers searched the ship. The crew was still there. Accounts differ regarding exactly where individual sailors were found, but the central detail remained remarkably consistent across retellings of the incident. Members of the Resolven's crew had not vanished. They had abandoned portions of the ship or clustered in fearful isolation, behaving in ways that deeply unsettled the men who boarded the vessel. Some reports suggested the sailors appeared exhausted and frightened beyond reason. Others claimed they resisted returning below deck or refused to explain what had happened aboard the brig. Whatever rescuers expected to encounter when approaching a drifting Atlantic merchant ship, they had not expected to find living sailors acting as though something remained hidden within the vessel itself. That distinction transformed the incident from a simple maritime emergency into something much more difficult to explain. Ghost ship stories traditionally depended upon absence. The mystery emerged because nobody remained to describe the final moments. The Mary Celeste, discovered deserted in 1872 between the Azores and Portugal, became legendary precisely because its crew disappeared without leaving definitive answers. Investigators could speculate endlessly because silence created limitless possibilities. But the Resolven introduced an entirely different kind of fear. Here, witnesses survived. Sailors lived long enough to speak. Yet according to later accounts surrounding the incident, they either refused to explain the cause of their terror or spoke so vaguely that no coherent explanation ever emerged. The silence itself became the centre of the mystery. 19th century sailors were not strangers to superstition, but maritime folklore developed from generations of exposure to isolation and death at sea. Stories spread rapidly through ports and dockyards because crews often depended upon oral warnings passed between mariners. Phantom lights, cursed routes, unexplained disappearances, and strange encounters formed part of the psychological landscape of Atlantic commerce. Yet experienced sailors were also practical men whose survival depended upon rational judgment. Fear aboard ships could become contagious, especially in darkness or storms, but panic severe enough to drive crews from safe sections of a vessel without visible danger remained unusual. The reports connected to the Resolven suggested precisely that kind of fear. Descriptions of the recovered crew emphasized emotional shock more than physical injury. The men were said to appear withdrawn, reluctant to remain aboard the vessel, and unwilling to provide detailed explanations regarding whatever forced them into such a state. Some later retellings exaggerated the story into outright supernatural territory, claiming sailors believed something unnatural moved below deck or occupied isolated compartments of the brig. Those details remain difficult to verify through surviving records, yet the persistence of such rumours revealed how deeply the incident disturbed people who heard about it. Maritime accidents rarely inspired legends unless some aspect resisted ordinary explanation. What made the Resolven especially unsettling was the absence of visible catastrophe. If the ship had suffered severe storm damage, the crew's behaviour might have appeared understandable. If the disease had spread abroad, isolation and confusion could explain their condition. If mutiny or violence had occurred, physical evidence likely would have remained. Instead, the brig occupied an uneasy space between survival and abandonment. The ship still floated. The crew still lived. Yet something aboard had apparently frightened experienced sailors so profoundly that even after rescue, they reportedly struggled or refused to explain what they encountered. Atlantic waters during that period already carried enough danger to shape men into hardened survivors. Temperatures near Newfoundland could become deadly even during calmer seasons, with cold currents moving southward from Arctic regions and generating dense fog capable of swallowing entire ships from sight within minutes. Icebergs drifting through the North Atlantic shipping lanes remained a persistent threat decades before the sinking of the Titanic would permanently etch those dangers into public memory. Mariners navigating those waters understood isolation in ways difficult to replicate on land. Once a vessel disappeared beyond the horizon, crews relied almost entirely upon themselves. That isolation also created an environment where uncertainty could become unbearable. The physical structure of merchant brigs intensified that feeling. Below deck, narrow passageways curved through darkness broken only by lantern glow. Cargo shifted with the movement of waves, producing creaks and impacts that echoed strangely through wooden hulls during storms. Bilge water collected beneath floorboards. Ventilation remained poor. During rough weather, sailors often worked for hours without proper rest while listening to the groaning of timber under pressure from heavy seas. Experienced crews learned to distinguish ordinary ship noises from sounds that indicated genuine danger. A sudden change in the rhythm of the vessel could alert sailors before visible damage even appeared. For the men aboard the Resolven, something in that familiar environment reportedly changed. The precise details remain obscured by conflicting accounts and incomplete records, but nearly every surviving retelling emphasizes the same emotional reality. The crew feared remaining aboard their own ship more than they feared the Atlantic itself. That fact alone deeply unsettled later investigators, because abandoning a damaged vessel in North Atlantic waters was often more dangerous than staying aboard. Lifeboats offered little protection against storms, freezing temperatures, or rough seas. Sailors generally remained with their ships as long as survival seemed possible. For experienced mariners to avoid certain sections of the brig or hesitate to explain events aboard suggested a level of fear difficult to dismiss as ordinary panic. Newspapers covering maritime incidents during the late 19th century frequently amplified mystery to attract readers, and over time the story of the Resolven accumulated embellishments common to many sea legends. Yet even stripped of later exaggeration, the central facts remained deeply strange. A commercial brig drifted damaged but afloat in Atlantic waters. Its crew survived. Rescuers reached the vessel expecting abandonment, and instead encountered sailors behaving as though some invisible threat still lingered somewhere aboard the ship. No definitive explanation ever emerged that fully erased the unease surrounding the case. The North Atlantic has preserved countless mysteries because the sea rarely provides complete answers. Ships vanish, records disappear, witnesses die. But the Resolven endured in maritime memory for a different reason entirely. The unanswered question was never simply what happened aboard the brig. The deeper mystery was why the men who survived appeared unwilling to speak plainly about it afterward. And when the rescued sailors finally began to talk, their silence proved more disturbing than panic itself. A silence more disturbing than panic. When the rescued sailors finally reached another deck beneath steady lantern light, their silence unsettled experienced mariners more than any storm report could have. The North Atlantic had always produced survivors who emerged shaken, frostbitten, or half delirious after days against heavy seas. But there remained a familiar rhythm to maritime disaster that sailors understood instinctively. Men rescued from wrecks usually spoke rapidly once they reached safety. They described broken masts, rogue waves, damaged rudders, collisions hidden by fog, or fires spreading below deck. Fear often demanded release after survival. Yet in the strange aftermath surrounding the Resolven, the silence itself became the first detail that witnesses remembered most clearly, because the crew behaved less like men escaping a visible catastrophe, and more like men attempting to distance themselves from something they could not fully describe. Along the Newfoundland coast, maritime recoveries followed routines shaped by necessity, discipline, and written testimony. Merchant traffic moving through Atlantic waters depended heavily upon cooperation between vessels, especially in dangerous conditions where storms or drifting ice could isolate ships from major ports for days. When sailors were recovered from damaged vessels, captains typically recorded statements concerning weather, navigation failures, cargo conditions, or accidents that threatened maritime safety. Such reports were practical necessities in an era when insurance claims, commercial disputes and inquiries into lost cargo could determine whether a voyage ruined a shipping company financially. Survivors, therefore, became crucial witnesses, expected to explain not only what happened aboard their vessel, but also why specific decisions had been made during moments of danger. Several accounts described the crew as physically capable of speaking, yet strangely unwilling to describe the cause of their abandonment. Reports connected to the Resolven were never fully consistent, partly because many surviving details originated from newspaper summaries and later maritime retellings rather than complete official transcripts. Even so, a recurring pattern appeared throughout the fragments that endured. The sailors did not behave like men unable to communicate because of injury or confusion. Instead, they reportedly answered questions cautiously, withholding details or reducing their explanations to vague statements that satisfied nobody listening. That distinction altered the atmosphere surrounding the case almost immediately. Silence caused by trauma could be understood. Deliberate avoidance created a different kind of unease entirely. Beneath layers of salt, exhaustion, and exposure, the sailors appeared preoccupied by something that rescuers themselves could not see. Accounts describing their condition emphasized weariness rather than visible wounds, suggesting prolonged strain rather than sudden violence aboard the brig. North Atlantic exposure alone could transform survivors physically within hours. Cold winds near Newfoundland carried moisture that penetrated heavy wool clothing, while freezing spray stiffened fabric and numbed fingers until simple tasks became difficult. Men rescued from lifeboats often suffered dehydration, fatigue, and mental confusion after prolonged exposure to rough seas. Yet even against that harsh maritime backdrop, the crew of the Resolven reportedly appeared disturbed in ways that exceeded ordinary exhaustion. In 19th century maritime practice, silence after an incident at sea often attracted more suspicion than visible damage. Investigators examining maritime accidents relied heavily upon testimony, because physical evidence could disappear quickly once damaged ships drifted, sank, or underwent repair. Captains were expected to account for navigational decisions. Crews were questioned regarding weather conditions and shipboard events. Even relatively minor incidents generated inquiries if cargo or insurance losses were involved. The unwillingness of sailors to clearly explain their actions therefore stood out sharply against the practical culture of maritime commerce. A crew abandoning a vessel that remained afloat demanded explanation, particularly when survival depended upon leaving the relative safety of the ship for smaller open boats exposed directly to Atlantic conditions. One detail surfaced repeatedly across later retellings of the case. The crew resisted returning below deck. The precise origins of this claim remain difficult to trace because surviving records concerning the Resolven are fragmented, yet the persistence of the detail helped shape the legend surrounding the vessel for decades afterward. Stories circulated among sailors and coastal communities suggesting that the men avoided certain compartments aboard the brig, even after rescue arrived. Whether these accounts reflected genuine witness statements or gradual embellishment remains uncertain, but their survival revealed how strongly the emotional atmosphere surrounding the ship affected those who heard about it. Maritime folklore often grows around isolated details that feel too specific to disappear entirely. Nothing in the condition of the brig seemed severe enough to explain why experienced mariners would prefer lifeboats to the relative safety of their own vessel. This contradiction became central to later speculation, because 19th century sailors understood better than most people how dangerous open Atlantic waters could become. Even damaged ships offered shelter, supplies, and structural stability unavailable in small boats vulnerable to cold waves and sudden weather shifts. Abandoning ship was typically regarded as a final decision reserved for situations where remaining aboard guaranteed death. If the Resolven had still possessed enough structural integrity to remain afloat when discovered, investigators naturally questioned what force or fear had overridden the crew's instinct to stay with their vessel. Witnesses reportedly struggled to obtain direct answers whenever the conversation drifted toward the final hours aboard the ship. Some later summaries of the incident described fragmented statements interrupted before completion, while others suggested that crew members redirected questions toward weather or damage, without explaining the deeper cause of their distress. The lack of coherent testimony gradually transformed the event into something more psychologically disturbing than a conventional maritime accident. Human beings often fear uncertainty more intensely than visible danger, because uncertainty prevents closure. The men from the Resolven survived long enough to speak, yet whatever they experienced aboard the brig remained hidden behind incomplete explanations and deliberate restraint. Unlike survivors of storms or collisions, the men from the Resolven did not describe a single catastrophic moment. Maritime disasters usually produced clear turning points that witnesses remembered vividly. The snap of masts during heavy seas, the impact of hidden reefs, fires spreading through cargo holds, or waves breaking across decks with enough force to sweep sailors overboard. Trauma often sharpened those memories because survival depended upon reacting quickly during chaos. But the accounts surrounding the Resolven lacked that kind of defined climax. Instead, the fear associated with the vessel appeared gradual and unresolved, as though the danger aboard the brig never revealed itself clearly enough to describe with certainty. Throughout Atlantic shipping communities, sailors were accustomed to hearing frightened men recount terrible weather, injuries, and near sinkings. Ports functioned as vast networks of exchanged experience, where stories moved rapidly between crews preparing for departure or returning from long voyages. Dockside taverns, chandlery shops, and harbour offices became informal archives of maritime knowledge, preserving warnings about storms, dangerous coastlines, and unusual incidents at sea. Sailors listened carefully to one another because practical survival often depended upon information carried orally between crews. Yet stories connected to the Resolven spread differently from ordinary accounts of disaster. The unease surrounding the brig came not from dramatic descriptions but from the absence of them. Certain versions of the story later claimed that fragmented remarks emerged from the crew only after repeated questioning. These accounts varied considerably over time, with some implying that sailors referred vaguely to movement aboard the vessel, while others suggested fear connected to the lower sections of the brig. Such details cannot be fully verified through surviving documentation, and many almost certainly expanded through retelling as the incident drifted deeper into maritime folklore. Yet legends rarely emerge without some emotional foundation anchoring them to reality. The fact that later generations continued associating the Resolven with hidden fear rather than visible disaster suggested that the original witnesses conveyed an atmosphere disturbing enough to linger long after precise details disappeared. During long voyages, merchant sailors depended heavily upon predictable routines because repetition created stability against the uncertainty of the sea. Watches changed according to strict schedules. Meals followed limited but familiar patterns. Equipment inspections, sail adjustments, navigation checks, and cargo maintenance filled hours that might otherwise dissolve into isolation and monotony. Life aboard small brigs required constant cooperation between crew members because exhaustion could quickly become dangerous if discipline weakened. Sudden changes to those routines often signaled that something aboard the ship had shifted beyond ordinary control. Even small disruptions could spread anxiety rapidly among crews living within confined spaces, surrounded by darkness and cold Atlantic water. The psychological strain of maritime isolation should not be underestimated within the context of the Resolven mystery. 19th century sailors spent weeks or months separated from land, exposed to relentless environmental pressure that modern audiences rarely experience directly. Storms erased visibility. Dense fog consumed sound and distance until ships appeared suspended inside featureless grey emptiness. At night, lantern light illuminated only fragments of the deck while the sea remained invisible beyond the railings. Merchant crews developed emotional resilience through necessity, but prolonged stress also heightened sensitivity to uncertainty. Strange sounds within wooden hulls, unexplained movement in cargo, or persistent unease among crew members could gradually transform confined ships into psychologically oppressive environments. No official explanation ever fully clarified why the crew abandoned sections of a vessel that remained afloat and structurally intact. Over time, theories emerged attempting to impose order upon the fragments left behind by the case. Some later commentators suggested that storm damage or fear of sinking may have triggered panic disproportionate to the actual condition of the brig. Others pointed toward possible cargo-related dangers, including fumes or shifting loads capable of frightening exhausted sailors already operating under extreme stress. Yet none of those explanations fully accounted for the emotional pattern preserved in the surviving accounts. The men connected to the Resolven did not merely appear frightened of disaster. They behaved as though they feared something still present aboard the vessel itself. That distinction continued to separate the Resolven from more familiar maritime mysteries. ghost ship legends traditionally relied upon disappearance because empty vessels allowed imagination to flourish unchecked. But the Resolven carried witnesses who survived long enough to shape the atmosphere surrounding the event personally. Their fear became part of the evidence, the evasive testimony, the reluctance to discuss certain details, and the absence of a clear explanation created a mystery that felt more intimate and psychologically unsettling than stories built solely upon vanished crews. Here, the unanswered question did not emerge from absence alone. It emerged from men who apparently saw something they could neither comfortably describe nor entirely forget. As investigators attempted to reconstruct the event, attention slowly shifted away from the sailors' incomplete testimony and toward the voyage itself. If the crew refused to explain what transformed the brig into a place they no longer trusted, then the only remaining path toward understanding lay in retracing the Resolven's final ordinary days before fear spread through the ship. Somewhere within the routine rhythms of the voyage, long before the brig drifted through Atlantic waters in fearful silence, the first unnoticed cracks in the Resolven story had already begun to form, the last ordinary voyage. By the time investigators turned their attention back toward the beginning of the voyage, the Resolven silence had already transformed ordinary records into uneasy evidence. Maritime inquiries often depended upon rebuilding timelines from fragments that initially appeared meaningless on their own. Departure logs, cargo manifests, weather summaries, harbour observations, and the remembered routines of sailors who rarely imagined their daily labour would later become part of a mystery. In the case of the Resolven, the lack of clear testimony forced investigators into an unusual position. Since the crew either could not or would not explain what happened aboard the brig, attention gradually shifted toward the final ordinary days before fear overtook the vessel. The investigation no longer centered upon a single dramatic event at sea. Instead, it became an attempt to identify the moment when routine slowly began to change into something the sailors themselves struggled to understand. Across the docks of Cardiff during the late 19th century, departures followed rhythms so familiar that most voyages disappeared into routine before the tide even carried ships beyond sight of land. Cardiff had become one of the busiest coal-exporting ports in the world during the Victorian era, its waterfront crowded with merchant ships loading cargo bound for destinations across the Atlantic. Sailors, dock workers, shipbrokers, and customs officials moved constantly through forests of masts and rigging, while cranes and pulleys groaned above whetstone quays darkened by coal dust and seawater. For crews preparing to depart, the work remained practical and repetitive. Supplies were inspected, ropes secured, barrels counted, sails checked for wear, and provisions loaded into cramped storage compartments that would sustain sailors during weeks at sea. Nothing about such preparations appeared remarkable, because maritime commerce depended upon repetition surviving unchanged day after day. Cargo lists associated with merchant brigs rarely attracted much attention, unless disaster later forced authorities to examine them more closely. Commercial vessels like the Resolven operated within a shipping system built upon documentation, where manifests recorded cargo ownership, destination ports, and approximate values necessary for customs and insurance purposes. Surviving references connected to the brig indicate that the ship carried a commercial cargo typical of transatlantic trade during the period, though some details vary across later accounts. Timber, coal, manufactured goods, and raw materials moved constantly between Britain and North America during the late 19th century, filling the holds of vessels that crossed Atlantic routes in every season despite storms and dangerous weather. At the time of departure, the Resolven appeared indistinguishable from countless other merchant brigs carrying ordinary cargo into cold ocean waters. Two-masted vessels like the Resolven depended upon constant maintenance, because Atlantic crossings exposed even well-built ships to relentless strain. Wooden hulls expanded and contracted with moisture and temperature changes, while rigging endured immense pressure from shifting winds capable of tearing canvas apart within minutes during heavy weather. Sailors routinely repaired ropes, inspected spars, adjusted sails, and monitored the condition of the hull throughout voyages because even minor damage could become dangerous if neglected long enough. Merchant brigs were designed for endurance rather than comfort, and crews lived within confined wooden structures that creaked continuously beneath wind pressure and wave impact. The sea never allowed ships complete stillness. Every movement of water beneath the hull transferred directly into the structure of the vessel itself. Morning preparations aboard commercial sailing ships began long before departure, with crews inspecting rigging, securing supplies, and checking sail conditions against changing weather. Maritime labour in the 19th century demanded constant physical effort, regardless of exhaustion, particularly aboard smaller merchant ships operating with limited crews. Sailors climbed rigging before dawn, hauled wet ropes stiffened by salt water, and worked across narrow decks made slippery by rain or sea spray. Officers and captains monitored weather conditions carefully, because Atlantic crossings depended heavily upon wind patterns, impossible to predict with complete accuracy. Before the development of modern forecasting systems, mariners relied upon barometers, cloud formations, changing winds, and personal experience gathered through years at sea. Small shifts in weather often carried consequences that only experienced sailors recognized immediately. Nothing recorded about the brig's final departure initially suggested that the voyage would survive in maritime memory for more than a century. That fact would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the Resolven mystery, because disasters often appear obvious in retrospect while remaining invisible in the moment. The brig departed into Atlantic waters under conditions familiar to thousands of merchant sailors before and after Itim. Crews boarded vessels expecting difficult weather, physical exhaustion, and long stretches of isolation because those conditions defined maritime labour itself. The Resolven did not leave the harbour surrounded by rumours or visible catastrophe. It entered the Atlantic quietly, another working ship disappearing westward into trade routes crowded with commercial traffic and unpredictable weather. Beneath the outward routine of 19th century shipping, life aboard small merchant vessels remained physically exhausting and psychologically isolating. Crews aboard brigs often numbered only a handful of men responsible for maintaining sails, navigating dangerous weather, handling cargo, repairing damage, and sustaining the ship continuously throughout long voyages. Sleep occurred in short intervals interrupted by rotating watches and changing sea conditions. Privacy barely existed aboard vessels where sailors lived within narrow quarters saturated by damp air, sweat, smoke, and salt water. During rough weather, ordinary tasks became dangerous physical struggles against freezing winds and unstable footing. Yet sailors adapted because routine created familiarity strong enough to suppress fear under most circumstances. Lantern light below deck revealed a world far different from the open air above, where cargo compartments narrowed into cramped wooden passages heavy with dampness and shifting shadows. Conditions beneath the deck changed constantly according to weather and cargo type. Timber creaked under strain while barrels shifted subtly with the motion of the waves, producing sounds capable of echoing strangely through confined spaces during nighttime watches. Ventilation remained poor aboard many merchant vessels, especially during storms when hatches were sealed against rough seas. The smell below deck often blended wet wood, rope fibres, bilge water, cargo residue, and oil smoke into an atmosphere thick enough to linger permanently within sailors' clothing. For experienced crews, such environments felt ordinary even when uncomfortable. Familiarity allowed sailors to distinguish routine ship noises from sounds suggesting structural damage or hidden danger. Weather conditions across the North Atlantic could alter dramatically within hours, especially near the colder waters surrounding Newfoundland and the Labrador Current. Maritime records from the late 19th century repeatedly describe fog banks dense enough to reduce visibility almost completely, while sudden storms transformed relatively calm seas into violent swells capable of damaging rigging and flooding decks. Ocean currents in the region also carried freezing water southward from Arctic areas, creating sharp temperature changes that intensified fog formation and complicated navigation. Long before modern communication systems allowed ships to exchange weather information quickly, vessels entering these waters relied almost entirely upon their own observations. Captains understood that Atlantic weather often concealed danger gradually rather than dramatically. Every sailor aboard a brig occupied a defined role within a hierarchy that depended upon discipline rather than comfort. Captains carried ultimate authority over navigation and ship management, while mates supervised watches and coordinated labour, necessary to maintain the vessel continuously. Ordinary seamen handled sails, steering, repairs, and cargo-related duties that demanded physical endurance more than formal education. Maritime hierarchy mattered because small crews could not function effectively during dangerous conditions without clear command structures. Fatigue, storms, and isolation tested discipline constantly during long voyages, Even minor tension between crew members could spread quickly aboard confined vessels, where sailors possessed little opportunity to separate themselves from one another. During extended crossings, repetition became one of the few defences sailors possessed against exhaustion and uncertainty. Watches changed according to strict schedules, while meals followed predictable routines shaped by limited provisions carried aboard ship. Sailors measured time through bells marking shifts rather than calendars, or clocks meaningful on land. The Atlantic itself encouraged psychological monotony, because days often unfolded beneath endless grey horizons, broken only by weather changes or distant ships appearing briefly, before vanishing again into fog or darkness. In such environments, small irregularities could acquire unusual emotional weight. A sound heard repeatedly at night, unexplained movement below deck, or disrupted routine sometimes lingered in sailors' minds longer than visible storms because uncertainty remained harder to confront directly. Isolated remarks preserved in later retellings hinted that subtle unease may have appeared aboard the vessel before the crew ever abandoned it. These claims remain difficult to verify conclusively because surviving evidence connected to the Resolven survives only in fragments shaped partly by later folklore. Yet historians examining maritime mysteries often encounter similar patterns, where ordinary details become suspicious only after disaster occurs. A crew member complaining of disturbed sleep, unusual caution surrounding certain cargo areas, or reluctance to work alone below deck might attract no attention during an uneventful voyage. Afterward, however, those same details appear transformed into possible warnings overlooked in the moment. Certain sounds aboard wooden sailing ships were so common that experienced sailors learned to ignore them almost instinctively. Hulls groaned under pressure from shifting seas, while ropes snapped against masts and loose cargo settled unpredictably during rough weather. Water striking the hull beneath deck created irregular rhythms that changed according to wind direction and wave conditions. Rats moved through storage compartments on many merchant ships, especially vessels carrying food supplies or timber cargo. The Atlantic itself contributed constant noise through wind, spray, and the endless motion of water surrounding the Vesses. Sailors surviving long voyages developed an intimate understanding of these familiar sounds because recognizing unusual changes could mean the difference between safety and disaster. Reports connected to the Resolven later suggested that some routines aboard the brig may have begun changing gradually rather than suddenly. Certain accounts implied that sailors avoided isolated sections of the ship during nighttime watches, while others hinted at growing unease surrounding the lower compartments below deck. None of these claims can be confirmed with certainty, yet their persistence across multiple retellings suggests that the atmosphere aboard the brig may have shifted long before rescue vessels encountered it, drifting in Atlantic waters. Fear rarely appears fully formed without warning. More often, uncertainty grows slowly through repetition, coincidence, and the inability to explain disturbances that initially seem too minor to justify alarm. Far from land, small disruptions aboard merchant ships often carried unusual weight, because crews had nowhere else to escape the tension building around them. Unlike life ashore, sailors at sea could not separate themselves from unsettling environments, or avoid difficult conditions through distance. Every sound, rumour, or unexplained incident remained trapped within the same confined wooden structure, moving endlessly through dark water. Emotional stray, and therefore accumulated differently aboard ships than it did on land. A single frightening experience could continue affecting an entire crew because the environment offered no relief from constant proximity to whatever caused the unease in the first place. No surviving record identifies a precise moment when ordinary discomfort aboard the Resolven first turned into genuine apprehension. That uncertainty remains central to the enduring power of the case, because investigators never uncovered a clear dividing line between normal maritime hardship and whatever later terrified the crew into abandoning sections of their own vessel. The reconstructed timeline reveals no confirmed mutiny, collision, fire, or catastrophic storm severe enough to explain the emotional aftermath surrounding the brig. Instead, the voyage appears to drift gradually away from ordinary reality through fragments too incomplete to interpret confidently and too persistent to dismiss entirely. As the reconstructed timeline approached the final days before the drifting brig was discovered, attention increasingly settled upon the lower sections of the vessel. The physical structure of merchant brigs naturally concentrated darkness and isolation below deck, where lantern light illuminated only narrow portions of cargo compartments crowded by shadows, hanging ropes, and shifting freight. Sailors descending into those spaces during nighttime watches relied heavily upon memory and familiarity because visibility remained limited even under calm conditions. If something aboard the Resolven first unsettled the crew before panic fully emerged, investigators increasingly suspected that the earliest signs may have originated somewhere beneath the visible routines unfolding above deck. Deep within the narrow compartments below the brig's main deck, the first truly unsettling signs aboard the Resolven may have emerged long before anyone understood what they were becoming. The shape seen below deck. Within reconstructed maritime accounts of the Resolven, attention repeatedly returns to the lower compartments where visibility was limited and testimony later became inconsistent. Unlike the broader narrative of the voyage, which could be pieced together from port records, cargo documentation, and general maritime procedures, this particular section of the ship exists almost entirely through fractured recollection. The lower deck was not an unusual feature for 19th century brigs, yet it became the focal point of uncertainty because it was the one space where multiple accounts failed to align. Investigators attempting to understand the Resolven repeatedly encountered the same obstacle. When the discussion shifted below deck, the clarity of the narrative dissolved into contradictions that could not be reconciled with confidence. Cargo holds aboard 19th century merchant brigs were built with strict functional design, prioritizing storage capacity over accessibility or illumination. Timber beams formed narrow corridors, and goods were stacked in tightly packed formations intended to maximize efficiency during long transatlantic crossings. Light rarely reached the deepest sections of these compartments, especially when hatchways were closed during rough weather or nighttime watches. Sailors entering these spaces depended on lanterns that cast limited illumination, often producing uneven visibility where objects near the edges of light could appear distorted or partially obscured. This environment was not unusual for experienced crews, yet it also created conditions where perception could easily be shaped by movement, shadow, and the constant instability of a ship in motion. Among the fragmented recollections attributed to the Resolven's crew, certain descriptions diverge sharply in their interpretation of what occurred below deck. Some accounts suggest that sailors reported noticing unusual movement within cargo areas, while others imply that the same observations were dismissed as ordinary shifts caused by the motion of the sea. No single version of events remains consistent across all retellings, and this lack of agreement becomes one of the defining features of the case. The difficulty lies not in the presence of a specific claim, but in the inability to establish a stable version of what was actually perceived in those confined spaces beneath the main deck. Structural conditions inside wooden sailing vessels often distorted sound and movement in ways that complicated even experienced sailors' ability to interpret what they were perceiving. Timber hulls responded continuously to pressure from waves, producing creaks, groans, and sudden shifts that echoed unpredictably through enclosed compartments. Cargo stored within holds could amplify these sounds, especially when items were loosely secured or partially unstable due to long exposure to rolling seas. Under such conditions, distinguishing between normal ship activity and something genuinely unusual required familiarity and calm judgment, both of which were difficult to maintain during extended voyages, where fatigue and environmental stress accumulated over time. Visibility below deck on Atlantic crossings depended entirely upon lantern placement, and even minor shifts in light could alter the perceived shape of surrounding objects. Shadows formed by stacked cargo or hanging equipment could stretch or compress depending on the angle of illumination, creating visual effects that sometimes obscured spatial boundaries. Sailors moving through these environments often relied on memory and touch as much as sight, particularly in deeper sections of the hold where light failed to penetrate fully. In such restricted conditions, perception became inherently unstable, and what appeared in one moment could change entirely in the next without any physical alteration to the space itself. Disagreement among surviving accounts of the voyage suggests that no single version of events below deck ever achieved consensus among those who were aboard. This lack of agreement is significant not because it confirms a particular explanation, but because it reveals the limits of collective memory under maritime conditions. When multiple witnesses describe the same environment in incompatible ways, investigators are left not with confirmation but with fragmentation. In the case of the Resolven, this fragmentation extends specifically into the lower deck, where recollections diverge not only in detail, but in fundamental interpretation of what was seen or heard. Throughout maritime history, sailors frequently distinguished between ordinary ship behaviour and what they described as moments when a vessel felt unfamiliar or unsettled. These descriptions rarely referred to concrete physical changes and instead reflected subtle shifts in perception caused by environmental stress, fatigue, or prolonged exposure to isolation at sea. Wooden ships under sail produced constant sensory input, and experienced crews became highly attuned to changes that might indicate damage or danger. Yet this heightened awareness also meant that unfamiliar combinations of ordinary sounds or movements could be interpreted differently depending on context, leading to varied accounts even among sailors who shared the same environment. Certain descriptions associated with the Resolven refer indirectly to movement or presence within cargo space, though none of these accounts provide consistent detail. Some narratives imply that attention was drawn towards specific areas of the hold, while others avoid specifying any exact location altogether. What remains consistent is not the description of an object or entity, but the sense that something within the lower deck prompted attention that could not be easily dismissed. The absence of clarity in these accounts prevents any definitive conclusion, leaving only the impression that multiple observers interpreted the same environment in fundamentally different ways. In wooden brigs operating on long Atlantic routes, cargo stability was monitored continuously because shifting loads could produce unexpected noise or imbalance. Sailors regularly inspected stored goods to ensure that movement from rough seas did not compromise the structural integrity of the hold. Even small shifts in weight distribution could alter how a ship handles in water, making cargo management an essential part of daily maritime labour. These practical realities provide a rational framework for understanding why unusual sounds or sensations might occur below deck, yet they do not fully account for why such occurrences became central to later recollections of the Resolven voyage. Variations in sailor testimony regarding the lower deck may reflect not only memory differences, but also the environmental limitations of observation in confined maritime spaces. Conditions aboard ships rarely allowed for controlled or repeated observation of the same event, particularly during active voyages where crew members moved continuously between duties. Lighting, weather, fatigue, and timing all influenced what could be seen or heard at any given moment. As a result, even sincere and accurate recollections could diverge significantly when reconstructed later, especially if those recollections were filtered through stress or an incomplete understanding of what had actually occurred at the time. Maritime investigations from the 19th century often recorded how darkness and restricted visibility influenced crew interpretations of onboard conditions. Official inquiries into shipping incidents regularly noted that limited illumination below deck could produce confusion during inspections or emergency situations. In environments where lantern light provided the only source of visibility, even experienced sailors could misjudge distances, shapes, or movement within cargo spaces. These limitations were well understood within maritime practice, yet they also created conditions where uncertainty was unavoidable whenever detailed observation was required in poorly lit sections of a vessel. Some interpretations of the Resolven incident suggest that what was perceived below deck may have differed depending on position, lighting, and timing during observation. A sailor standing near a hatchway might see only partial movement within the hold, while another moving deeper into the compartment could encounter entirely different visual conditions. Such variability is consistent with known maritime environments, where perception is shaped not only by physical reality, but also by the constraints of observation itself. In this context, conflicting accounts do not necessarily indicate contradiction in events, but rather inconsistency in the conditions under which those events were observed. Across documented seafaring traditions, sailors occasionally described moments where familiar sections of a ship appeared unfamiliar under specific conditions. These descriptions rarely indicated structural change and instead reflected psychological responses to environmental stresses, such as fatigue, isolation, or prolonged exposure to monotony. Ships at sea existed in a constant state of motion, and this perpetual movement could subtly alter perception over time. When combined with darkness and confined space, even routine areas of a vessel could feel temporarily unfamiliar, especially during extended voyages where physical and mental exhaustion accumulated among crew members. No surviving reconstruction of the Resolven's interior conditions provides a definitive explanation for the conflicting accounts tied to the cargo hold. The absence of clear documentation leaves investigators dependent upon fragmented testimony and general maritime knowledge rather than precise evidence. While structural conditions of brigs are well understood in the historical context, the specific experiences of the Resolven's crew remain irretrievable beyond partial and inconsistent recollection. This gap between known maritime structure and unknown personal experience defines the central uncertainty surrounding the lower deck. As later analyses attempt to align fragmented testimony, the lower deck becomes less a physical location and more a point of unresolved contradiction. What should have been a clearly defined section of the vessel instead transforms into an interpretive space where perception fails to stabilize into agreement. The result is not a confirmed account of an event, but a convergence of incompatible observations that resist unification under any single explanation. The cargo hold remains, in every reconstruction, the place where certainty dissolves most completely. The absence of consistent agreement among witnesses prevents any single interpretation of events below deck from emerging as authoritative. Without convergence in testimony, investigators are left with overlapping but incompatible versions of the same confined space, each shaped by conditions that cannot be fully reconstructed. In such cases, maritime history often preserves uncertainty rather than resolution, allowing multiple possibilities to coexist without confirmation. The Resolven becomes one such case, where the lower deck remains defined not by what was proven to exist, but by what could never be agreed upon by those who were there. When examined collectively, the surviving accounts surrounding the Resolven reveal a pattern defined more by uncertainty than by descriptive clarity. The inconsistencies do not point toward a single identifiable cause, but instead highlight the limitations of perception under maritime conditions where light, movement, and fatigue constantly influence interpretation. In this sense, the lower deck does not function as a location of confirmed mystery, but as a reflection of how fragile observation becomes when confined within unstable environments at sea. Beyond the contested space of the cargo holds, the Atlantic itself soon imposed conditions that overwhelmed every remaining attempt at interpretation: storms, shadows, and maritime fear. Maritime psychology suggests that fear at sea rarely begins with a visible cause, but instead emerges gradually from conditions that alter perception over time. In 19th century Atlantic navigation, crews did not encounter the ocean as a static environment, but as a constantly shifting system of motion, sound, and isolation that removed familiar reference points for judgment. Unlike land-based environments, where distance and orientation could be verified through stable landmarks, life aboard a sailing vessel required sailors to interpret reality through unstable signals such as wind direction, hull movement, and changing light. Within such conditions, fear was not always triggered by a single event, but often developed through accumulation, where uncertainty itself became a persistent background state. Conditions aboard long 19th century voyages placed sailors in environments where isolation, darkness, and constant motion formed the baseline of daily existence. Merchant brigs and similar vessels operated for weeks or months at a time without contact with land, crossing vast sections of ocean where visual reference points disappeared entirely. During these periods, crews lived within tightly confined wooden structures, surrounded by water in every direction and dependent entirely upon the ship's integrity for survival. Even when the weather was calm, the absence of external landmarks created a sense of spatial detachment that distinguished maritime life from nearly every other form of labour during the period. Historical accounts of seafaring life consistently describe night watches as periods where perception narrowed to sound, movement, and the uncertain rhythm of the ship itself. Darkness at sea was not merely the absence of light, but a condition that eliminated most visual information beyond the immediate reach of lanterns. Sailors assigned to night watches relied heavily on auditory cues and tactile awareness, listening for changes in rigging tension, sail movement, or hull behaviour that might indicate shifting weather or structural stress. In such conditions, the boundary between normal ship activity and unfamiliar disturbance could become difficult to define with certainty. Extended isolation at sea affected crews not only physically, but also in the way ordinary stimuli were interpreted under prolonged fatigue. Sleep patterns aboard sailing vessels were fragmented by rotating watches, unpredictable weather, and continuous maintenance requirements that demanded attention regardless of exhaustion. Over time, this irregularity in rest contributed to heightened sensitivity, where small environmental changes could appear more significant than they would under stable conditions. Maritime records from the period frequently note that fatigue altered judgment, particularly during long crossings where crews had limited opportunity for recovery. Documented sailor behaviour under stress shows that exhaustion often reshaped how harmless shipboard noises were perceived during long Atlantic crossings. Wooden hulls naturally produced a wide range of sounds as they responded to wave pressure, temperature changes, and cargo movement. Yet experienced sailors typically learned to distinguish between routine structural noise and signals indicating potential danger. Under conditions of extreme fatigue, however, this distinction could become less reliable, leading to heightened attention towards sounds that would otherwise be ignored. In confined environments where silence and noise alternated unpredictably, perception itself became increasingly dependent on mental state. 19th century navigation conditions relied heavily upon experience and limited instruments, leaving crews exposed to uncertainty whenever weather patterns shifted unexpectedly. Tools such as compasses, sextants, and chronometers provided essential guidance, but their effectiveness depended upon visibility, clear skies, and accurate interpretation by experienced officers. When fog, storms, or overcast conditions reduced visibility, navigation became more difficult, and crews were forced to rely on accumulated knowledge of sea behaviour and approximate positioning. This reliance on interpretation rather than direct observation contributed to a broader environment of uncertainty during extended voyages. Patterns observed in Atlantic crossings indicate that small environmental disruptions could accumulate into significant psychological strain over time. A single storm, a period of poor visibility, or an unexpected shift in wind direction might not individually alter the course of a voyage, but repeated exposure to such disruptions creates a cumulative effect on crew perception. Over weeks at sea, the distinction between routine difficulty and meaningful irregularity could blur, particularly when crews lacked external reference points for comparison. In this way, the Atlantic environment itself functioned as a continuous pressure system, acting upon both ship and crew simultaneously. Recorded maritime practices reveal that sailors often relied on shared beliefs and informal traditions to interpret moments that lacked clear explanation. These interpretive systems varied across regions and crews, but commonly included superstitions about weather patterns, ship behaviour, and unexpected occurrences at sea. While officers typically emphasised practical navigation and mechanical understanding, ordinary sailors sometimes incorporated folklore into their understanding of uncertain events. Such beliefs did not replace technical knowledge, but they often coexisted with it, providing a framework for discussing experiences that resisted immediate explanation. Within maritime folklore, certain experiences at sea were described not in terms of physical events, but as impressions of atmosphere or unease. Sailors occasionally referred to ships as feeling unsteady or wrong, even when no structural damage or navigational error could be identified. These descriptions rarely pointed to specific causes and instead reflected subjective interpretations of environmental conditions. In confined ship environments, where sensory input was limited and repetitive, such impressions could become significant markers of collective emotional state, rather than evidence of external phenomena. Psychological accounts of confined labour environments demonstrate how uncertainty can spread between individuals without any identifiable external trigger. Groups operating in isolated or high-stress conditions often develop shared interpretations of ambiguous stimuli, where emotional responses become synchronized over time. In maritime contexts, this effect could be amplified by physical confinement and constant proximity among crew members. When sailors worked, ate, and rested within the same limited space for extended periods, subtle changes in mood or perception could influence group behavior, even in the absence of a clear initiating event. Storm systems across the North Atlantic frequently intensified sensory distortion, making it difficult for crews to distinguish between structural sound and environmental noise. Heavy weather introduced powerful forces that acted directly upon ship hulls, sails, and rigging, producing vibrations and impacts that travelled through the wooden structure of the vessel. Rain, wind and wave activity created overlapping layers of sound that could obscure more subtle auditory cues. Under such conditions, even experienced sailors face challenges in isolating specific sources of noise within the overall acoustic environment of the ship. Atmospheric pressure changes and reduced visibility during storms often created conditions where spatial orientation aboard ships became unreliable. Fog and heavy precipitation could eliminate horizon lines, while shifting winds altered the vessel's movement in ways that were difficult to anticipate visually. Without stable external reference points, crews relied heavily on internal knowledge of the ship's structure and expected behaviour. However, when weather conditions remained unstable for extended periods, even familiar environments could feel less predictable, complicating routine navigation and maintenance tasks. Collective behaviour among isolated crews shows that shared environments can amplify emotional responses even when no direct cause is identifiable. Within confined maritime settings, emotional reactions could spread rapidly through observation, tone, and behaviour, particularly when crews were already operating under fatigue or environmental stress. This phenomenon does not require external triggers to function. Instead, it emerges from the interaction between individuals sharing the same limited space over time. In such environments, uncertainty itself can become a shared condition rather than an individual experience. Interpretations of maritime fear in historical records often reflect attempts to impose structure on experiences that were inherently unstable. When investigators or historians examine accounts of unexplained incidents at sea, there is a tendency to seek coherent explanations that align with known categories such as weather events, mechanical failure, or human error. However, many maritime records resist this categorization, particularly when they involve subjective experiences of crews rather than measurable physical evidence. The result is often a tension between documented observation and interpretive reconstruction. As analysis of seafaring conditions expands, attention shifts from individual events to the broader psychological patterns of life at sea. Rather than focusing solely on isolated incidents, maritime studies frequently examine how prolonged exposure to environmental stress shapes perception and behaviour over time. This broader perspective allows for a more comprehensive understanding of how crews adapted to long-distance navigation, as well as how uncertainty developed gradually within confined ship environments. In this context, fear becomes less an isolated reaction and more an emergent property of sustained conditions. The boundary between environmental stress and perceived threat becomes increasingly difficult to define within long-duration ocean voyages. Conditions that begin as manageable discomfort can, over time, evolve into persistent uncertainty when combined with fatigue, isolation, and sensory limitation. In maritime environments, this boundary is not always clearly marked, because the same conditions that produce routine operational challenges can also influence perception in subtle ways. As a result, distinguishing between external danger and internal interpretation becomes increasingly complex during extended crossings. When examined collectively, maritime conditions suggest that fear may originate as much from environment and endurance as from any specific incident. The accumulation of physical strain, sensory limitation, and psychological isolation creates a framework in which perception itself becomes more vulnerable to distortion. Within such a framework, experiences that appear unusual or threatening may arise not from a single external cause, but from the interaction of multiple ordinary conditions sustained over time. This perspective does not eliminate the possibility of specific events, but it emphasizes the difficulty of isolating them with certainty in maritime contexts. As theoretical reconstruction gives way to physical investigation, attention returns once more to the vessel itself and the spaces where uncertainty was first recorded. The abstract conditions of fear and perception must now be tested against the material reality of the ship, its structure, and the evidence preserved within its confined compartments. With theory now exhausted, investigators return to the physical vessel to examine the spaces where the unanswered accounts of the Resolven first took shape. The boarding party's search. Initial boarding assessments of the Resolven began under conditions typical of recovered merchant vessels, where priority was given to structural stability and seaworthiness before any interior examination was attempted. Salvage operations in the 19th century followed a practical order shaped by necessity rather than curiosity, since a drifting ship could still pose risks even after being located. boarding parties first confirmed whether the vessel was secure enough to enter safely, checking for water ingress, unstable rigging, or any signs that the hull might have been compromised during its time adrift. In the case of the Resolven, the exterior condition of the ship did not immediately suggest a disaster of the scale often associated with abandoned vessels at sea. Inspection of the vessel revealed no evidence of catastrophic failure, with hull integrity, masts and rigging showing no signs of collision, explosion, or grounding sufficient to explain the abandonment. The absence of visible structural trauma stood in stark contrast to the expectation that a crew would only leave a functioning ship under extreme circumstances. Wooden planks along the hull remained intact, seams showed no indication of sudden breach, and the mast structure held steady under inspection, suggesting that the vessel had not endured the kind of violent impact typically associated with maritime disaster. Even weather-related damage appeared limited to normal wear expected from the Atlantic Passage, rather than any singular destructive event. Cargo areas showed no immediate structural disruption, though the arrangement of stored materials indicated that movement within the holds had occurred prior to the ship being left adrift. Boxes, barrels, and bundled goods remained in place, yet their orientation suggested shifting consistent with heavy sea conditions rather than sudden internal collapse. In maritime salvage records, such details are often used to reconstruct the motion of a ship during its final days at sea, but in this case they offered no clear narrative of panic or forced evacuation. The cargo appeared neither violently scattered nor carefully secured in preparation for departure, existing instead in a state that reflected normal voyage instability. Cabin conditions suggested rapid departure rather than prolonged evacuation, with personal effects and navigational tools left in positions that implied interruption rather than orderly disembarkation. Items typically considered essential for continued navigation, such as charts, instruments, and routine equipment, remained within reach of working spaces. Sleeping quarters showed signs of recent use, yet nothing indicated systematic removal of belongings or preparation for abandonment. In maritime practice, abandonment of a seaworthy vessel without catastrophic cause was highly unusual, and such inconsistencies immediately drew attention from boarding personnel tasked with reconstructing the ship's final moments. Recorded observations from salvage crews noted that certain interior spaces appeared unusually undisturbed, as if sections of the vessel had been avoided during the final moments aboard. This observation did not indicate damage or obstruction, but rather an absence of typical usage patterns expected from a fully active crew. Areas that would normally show signs of repeated movement, such as access routes between deck levels and storage compartments, appeared less disturbed than surrounding sections of the ship. While this could be explained through simple operational variation, it also stood out against the broader expectation of uniform shipboard activity during an active voyage. No structural evidence indicated that the lower compartments of the Resolven had suffered damage beyond what would be expected from ordinary Atlantic Passage conditions. The integrity of beams, bulkheads, and internal framing remained consistent with long-term maritime exposure rather than sudden structural failure. In salvage documentation, such findings are critical because they eliminate many of the most common explanations for abandonment, including fire, flooding, or collision below deck. Yet in the case of the Resolven, the absence of a structural explanation did not resolve the question of why the crew had left a seaworthy vessel intact and afloat. Hull examination confirmed that the ship remained seaworthy at the time of discovery, with no breaches that would have required immediate evacuation under standard maritime protocol. Waterlines indicated normal displacement, and there was no evidence of progressive flooding that might have forced emergency abandonment. For experienced seamen involved in boarding operations, this fact carried particular weight, as it contradicted the assumption that survival instincts alone would dictate evacuation under life-threatening conditions. The ship, in mechanical terms, should not have required abandonment, yet it had clearly been left behind. Interior mapping of the ship suggested inconsistencies in how different sections had been accessed, with some areas showing signs of routine use while others remained largely untouched. These variations did not indicate structural division or obstruction, but instead pointed to differences in how frequently specific sections were occupied during the final stages of the voyage. In maritime documentation, such inconsistencies are not uncommon, but they become significant when paired with evidence of unexplained abandonment. The pattern suggested selective movement through the vessel, without a clear operational reason. Cargo documentation recovered during inspection aligned broadly with expected transatlantic trade patterns, offering no indication of unusual or illicit material that might explain the crew's departure. The manifest corresponded to known shipping practices of the period, reinforcing the view that the Resolven was engaged in routine commercial activity at the time of its final voyage. Nothing within the recorded cargo suggested volatility, danger or instability that would require emergency evacuation. This absence of explanatory material further deepened the inconsistency between the ship's condition and its abandoned state. Observations from boarding personnel recorded subtle hesitation when moving through confined interior passages, particularly in areas below the main deck where visibility was limited. These reactions were not formally classified as evidence, but were noted in supplementary remarks associated with the inspection process. Such responses are not uncommon during salvage operations, especially in vessels that have drifted unattended for extended periods, where silence and stillness can create a heightened awareness of enclosed space. However, in this case, the reactions were documented alongside an otherwise structurally normal environment. Comparative analysis of living quarters indicated that personal belongings had been left behind in a manner inconsistent with the planned abandonment of a functioning vessel. Items typically removed during emergency evacuation, such as navigational essentials, personal gear, or shared tools, remained distributed across the crew's living spaces. This suggested that departure from the ship had not followed standard emergency procedure, raising further questions about the conditions under which evacuation occurred. In maritime practice, such irregularity is often considered a key indicator when reconstructing unexplained abandonment events. Cargo handling equipment remained in place and operational, suggesting that no mechanical failure had forced the crew to evacuate the ship during active operations. Winches, ropes, and storage mechanisms showed no signs of breakdown or forced removal, reinforcing the conclusion that the vessel had not suffered sudden functional collapse. In most documented maritime disasters, equipment failure plays a significant role in determining abandonment decisions, yet here all major systems appeared intact. The ship had not ceased to function in any observable mechanical sense. Environmental conditions within the ship at the time of boarding reflected long-term exposure to salt air and moisture, consistent with standard maritime aging rather than sudden trauma. Wooden surfaces showed expected wear patterns, and interior spaces bore the marks of prolonged use at sea. Nothing within the environmental condition of the vessel indicated a sudden disruptive event that might have forced immediate evacuation. Instead, the ship presented itself as structurally familiar, almost routine in its state of preservation, despite the absence of its crew. Salvage records emphasize that no single point of damage or disruption could be identified as the catalyst for the crew's disappearance from the vessel. This absence of a definable trigger is one of the most significant findings in the boarding documentation, as it eliminates the usual explanatory anchors for maritime abandonment. Without structural failure, environmental catastrophe, or identifiable internal damage, the reasoning behind the evacuation becomes increasingly difficult to reconstruct using conventional investigative methods. The ship remains intact, yet inexplicable. Interior inspection reports repeatedly highlight the absence of clear causal indicators, despite thorough examination of all accessible compartments. Investigators methodically reviewed each section of the vessel, searching for physical evidence that could account for the crew's departure, yet no such evidence emerged. The Resolven therefore exists in a documented state where inspection yields confirmation of condition, but not explanation of outcome. This gap between observation and understanding defines the central difficulty of the case. Crew responses during boarding operations indicated unease in certain enclosed areas, though no physical cause for such reactions was documented in official records. These behavioural observations were noted alongside structural assessments, but remained separate from technical findings due to their subjective nature. In maritime salvage practice, such reactions are often recorded but rarely treated as evidence unless supported by physical correlates. In this instance, no such correlates were identified, leaving the responses unanchored to any observable condition within the ship. Systematic review of the Resolven ultimately produced a vessel that was structurally intact yet narratively unresolved, with no single element explaining the abandonment. The contradiction between physical condition and historical outcome became the defining characteristic of the investigation, as every examined system confirmed normal operation while the historical record confirmed complete evacuation. This divergence between material evidence and human action created a persistent investigative void that resisted conventional resolution. During final inspection rounds, attention narrowed toward a section of the ship that remained sealed or unaccounted for in the boarding report, preventing full verification of its condition. This area was not documented with the same level of access as other compartments, and its internal state was never conclusively recorded within the available salvage notes. As a result, the investigation concluded with one final space aboard the Resolven still outside confirmed observation, left unexamined as the boarding party withdrew from the vessel. One compartment aboard the Resolven remained without verified inspection, its condition recorded as inaccessible in the final boarding documentation. The locked compartment. Documentation concerning the sealed compartment aboard the Resolven indicates that attention during the final stages of inspection shifted toward a section of the vessel that remained inconsistently described across salvage records. What had begun as a comprehensive survey of a recovered merchant brig gradually narrowed into a more focused attempt to account for every enclosed space within the hull, yet even in structured maritime reporting, certain areas resisted uniform classification. The compartment in question was not initially presented as unusual in physical terms, but rather as uncertain in documentation, where descriptions varied depending on the sequence and authority of the reports compiled after boarding. In maritime investigations, such discrepancies are not uncommon, but they typically resolve once physical inspection confirms the condition of a space. In this case, however, resolution did not occur in any consistent form across surviving records. Records from boarding personnel indicate that most areas of the ship were examined systematically, yet one compartment continued to appear differently represented depending on the source of the report. Standard salvage procedure in the 19th century required methodical inspection from deck to hold, ensuring that no structural weakness or safety hazard remained unaccounted for before a vessel could be fully secured. The Resolven followed this pattern in its general inspection, with attention given to hull integrity, cargo stability, and living quarters. Yet when documentation reaches the section corresponding to the lowest interior compartments, descriptions begin to diverge in subtle but persistent ways, particularly in how access and verification were recorded. This divergence does not suggest error in procedure, but inconsistency in what was ultimately confirmed. Structural analysis of locked sections aboard 19th century merchant vessels shows that sealed compartments were commonly used for storage, reinforcement, or restricted access during long voyages. Merchant brigs often incorporated internal divisions designed to protect specific cargo types, or maintain ship balance under changing sea conditions. These spaces were typically secured with wooden barriers, metal fastenings, or reinforced hatch mechanisms intended to prevent accidental exposure during rough weather. In most cases, such compartments were fully documented and accounted for in cargo manifests or ship schematics. The presence of a sealed area aboard a vessel like the Resolven would not in itself have been unusual or indicative of irregular activity. Accounts referencing the inaccessible space aboard the Resolven diverge in describing whether the compartment had been deliberately secured or simply left unopened during initial inspection. Some boarding records imply that the section was treated as part of standard structural layout, requiring no immediate entry due to lack of external damage or concern. Other accounts suggest that the space was acknowledged but deferred for later examination, a common practice when prioritizing more accessible areas of a vessel first. What remains consistent is not the interpretation of the compartment's purpose, but the absence of a unified record confirming its final inspection status during the initial boarding phase. Maritime sealing practices of the period relied on mechanical fastenings, wooden reinforcements, and metal fixtures designed to prevent accidental opening during heavy seas. These systems were essential for maintaining structural integrity in environments where constant motion placed stress on every joint and surface of a ship. Compartmentalization allowed crews to control cargo movement, protect sensitive materials, and reduce the risk of internal shifting during storms. The design of such systems meant that a sealed space could remain secure for the entire duration of a voyage unless deliberately accessed by crew or inspectors. Within this context, a locked compartment aboard the Resolven would have functioned as a routine structural feature rather than an anomaly. Discrepancies in salvage reports suggest that no single boarding account fully confirms the condition of the locked compartment at the moment the Resolven was first examined. Maritime documentation from salvage operations often varies depending on the role of the observer, the timing of inspection, and the order in which areas are reviewed. In the case of the Resolven, this variation becomes more pronounced in relation to the sealed section, where some records emphasize its structural normality while others omit detailed description entirely. The absence of consistent documentation does not necessarily indicate significance, but it does prevent full reconstruction of the inspection process for that specific area of the vessel. The compartment in question was located in a section of the vessel where access required deliberate navigation through narrow interior passageways below the main deck. Such positioning was typical in merchant brigs, where structural efficiency dictated the arrangement of storage and reinforcement spaces deep within the hull. Movement through these areas would have required passage through confined corridors, often dimly lit and subject to limited ventilation. In salvage conditions, these environments could be difficult to assess quickly, particularly when attention was divided across multiple inspection priorities. The physical location of the compartment therefore placed it within one of the most structurally enclosed regions of the ship. Some secondary observations attributed to the boarding crew refer indirectly to unusual sounds perceived near sealed areas, though these remarks remain unverified within official documentation. Such references appear in supplementary notes rather than primary inspection logs, and they lack corroboration from multiple sources. In maritime reporting, secondary observations are often recorded when inspectors note environmental conditions that do not directly influence structural findings. However, without consistent repetition across multiple accounts, these remarks cannot be treated as confirmed evidence of any specific condition within the vessel. They remain isolated references within a broader and largely consistent structural assessment. Historical patterns in maritime salvage indicate that inaccessible compartments were not uncommon, particularly in vessels that had drifted without crew supervision for extended periods. Ships recovered at sea often presented practical challenges for inspection teams, especially when internal access had been altered by weather exposure or shifting cargo. In such cases, certain areas could remain temporarily unexamined until conditions allowed for safer entry or more detailed assessment. The presence of an unverified space aboard the Resolven therefore aligns with known limitations of salvage operations, rather than representing a deviation from expected procedure. The absence of consistent entry records for the locked section prevents any definitive reconstruction of what, if anything, occurred inside it prior to boarding. Maritime investigations rely heavily on sequential documentation to establish timelines of inspection, yet in this case, the sequence surrounding the compartment remains incomplete. Without clear confirmation of entry, condition, or internal observation, the space exists only as a point of procedural uncertainty within an otherwise documented inspection. This gap does not introduce new evidence, but highlights the limits of reconstructive certainty in maritime salvage records. In certain interpretations of salvage procedure, sealed spaces aboard recovered ships are treated as neutral zones unless physical evidence suggests otherwise. Investigators typically prioritize areas showing visible damage, environmental risk, or operational significance before addressing compartments that appear structurally stable and externally unchanged. This approach allows for efficient assessment of vessels under time constraints, particularly when dealing with drifting or partially unstable ships. Within this framework, an unexamined compartment would not necessarily be considered anomalous unless later findings required its reassessment. No documented attempt appears in the official records to forcibly breach the compartment during the initial inspection of the Resolven. Forced entry into sealed sections of recovered ships is generally reserved for cases where structural failure, safety concerns, or direct evidence of obstruction necessitate immediate action. In the absence of such indicators, inspectors often defer invasive examination to later stages of review. The Resolven records do not indicate that this threshold was reached for the locked compartment, leaving its internal condition formally unrecorded within the primary salvage documentation. Variations in recollection among boarding personnel reflect uncertainty, not only about what was observed, but about whether the compartment was prioritized at all during the search. Human memory in operational environments is often influenced by task sequencing, environmental pressure, and the division of attention across multiple responsibilities. As a result, later accounts may emphasize different aspects of the same inspection depending on individual focus and role. In the case of the Resolven, This divergence contributes to the lack of unified narrative surrounding the sealed section. The structural condition of the sealed section showed no external indication of damage or forced closure beyond standard maritime wear. Wooden surfaces, fastening points, and surrounding framework appeared consistent with long-term exposure to marine conditions, rather than sudden impact or mechanical failure. In maritime inspection, such findings typically suggest stability rather than concern, reinforcing the assumption that the compartment had not been compromised during the vessel's final voyage. Without visible irregularity, the space remained classified within normal structural parameters. As examination of the vessel progressed, attention gradually moved away from general inspection toward the unresolved status of the inaccessible compartment. This shift did not occur as a result of new evidence, but rather through the natural narrowing of focus that follows completion of broader structural assessment. Once the ship's overall condition had been established as sound, remaining uncertainties became more prominent simply due to their isolation within an otherwise resolved inspection. The compartment therefore emerged not through discovery, but through contrast with everything that had already been accounted for. The compartment's significance emerges primarily through absence of information, rather than through any confirmed physical anomaly. In maritime investigation, gaps in documentation can become notable simply because they resist closure within otherwise complete records. The sealed section aboard the Resolven represents such a gap, defined not by what was found within it, but by the lack of consistent record confirming what was observed there. This absence does not establish cause, but it preserves uncertainty within an otherwise structurally explained vessel. When all recorded observations are considered collectively, the locked section remains the only area of the Resolven without consistent descriptive documentation. Every other part of the ship is accounted for through overlapping inspection records, structural assessments, and cargo verification. Yet this single compartment persists as an exception within the archival record. Its status is not defined by damage, anomaly, or confirmed event, but by the inability of multiple accounts to converge upon a single description of its inspection. It remains, therefore, a documented space that resists complete documentation. Once the inspection records ended, fragmented accounts of the unresolved compartment began appearing outside official salvage documentation along the Welsh coastline. Rumours along the Welsh coast. News carried outward from Welsh coastal ports began circulating through dockside communities almost immediately after official salvage activity concluded. The movement of information followed no formal structure, instead relying on the natural rhythm of maritime life, where crews arriving from one harbour often replaced those departing for another, carrying fragments of recent events along with cargo and provisions. In such environments, even minor incidents at sea could travel far beyond their point of origin within days, reshaped each time they were repeated. The Resolven entered this system not as a fully documented case, but as a partially understood occurrence, already marked by uncertainty in its earliest retellings. Harbourside exchanges between departing and arriving crews passed along fragmented information about the abandoned vessel through informal spoken communication. These exchanges typically occurred in transitional spaces such as loading docks, tavern entrances, and ship decks during cargo operations, where sailors compared recent voyages and exchanged warnings or observations. Within these brief interactions, details of the Resolven began to circulate in incomplete form, often stripped of context and reassembled according to the expectations of the listener. Over time, these repeated exchanges created parallel versions of the same event, each emphasizing different aspects of what had been found at sea. Early printed fragments appearing in regional maritime notices reflected the unstable nature of reporting, where incomplete verification produced conflicting versions of the same event. Maritime journalism of the period often depended on second-hand accounts submitted by correspondents located near ports, rather than direct observation of incidents at sea. As a result, early references to the Resolven varied in detail and emphasis, with some accounts focusing on abandonment, others on discovery, and still others on the condition of the vessel itself. These inconsistencies did not necessarily indicate error, but rather the limitations of communication between offshore events and coastal publication systems. Small fishing settlements along the Welsh shoreline repeated accounts of the Resolven in ways that gradually reshaped the incident into a shared but inconsistent narrative. Within these communities, information was transmitted orally, often during periods of inactivity between fishing cycles, when crews returned to shore and exchanged stories. Each retelling subtly altered emphasis, sometimes expanding minor details while omitting others entirely. Over time, the vessel became less a defined object of inquiry, and more a recurring subject of discussion shaped by collective interpretation rather than fixed record. Interlinked shipping routes connecting neighbouring ports allowed maritime stories to travel in layered succession, introducing subtle alterations with each retelling. Unlike written records, oral transmission across ports depended on repeated human interaction, where memory, emphasis, and audience expectation influenced how information was conveyed. A single account of the Resolven might pass through multiple crews before reaching a distant harbour, accumulating small changes at each stage. This process created a network of narrative variation that expanded the story beyond its original documented form. Competing interpretations of the vessel's fate circulated without convergence, leaving no single explanation capable of stabilizing public understanding. Some versions emphasized structural condition, others focused on abandonment, while others speculated about causes that had no basis in official inspection records. These interpretations existed simultaneously without hierarchy, sustained by the absence of a definitive public explanation that could resolve them. In such conditions, ambiguity itself became the dominant feature of the narrative rather than any specific claim. Broader maritime anxieties began merging with local retellings, once discussion extended beyond immediate harbour regions, shifting interpretation toward inherited seafaring fears. Coastal communities with strong maritime traditions often carried long-standing cultural frameworks for interpreting unusual events at sea, including ideas shaped by centuries of navigation, loss, and survival. When the Resolven entered these interpretive systems, it was filtered through pre-existing patterns of meaning that had developed independently of the actual salvage findings. This layering of cultural memory over documented fact contributed to the growing complexity of the vessel's reputation. Later recollections detached from official salvage documentation introduced references to unusual cargo, despite no such findings existing in verified inspection records. These references appeared primarily in informal retellings rather than structured reports, suggesting that they developed through narrative expansion rather than direct observation. In maritime storytelling environments, cargo is often used as a symbolic anchor for uncertainty, allowing listeners to imagine concealed causes behind unexplained events. The Resolven, lacking confirmed anomalies in its manifest, became a receptive subject for such reinterpretations. Certain shoreline narratives passed between fishing crews associated the vessel with illness or contamination, reflecting recurring maritime fears of unseen exposure during long voyages. These interpretations aligned with broader historical concerns surrounding ships returning from extended periods at sea, where isolation and limited medical understanding often led to speculation about invisible threats. In the case of the Resolven, no evidence of disease or contamination appeared in official records, yet the absence of explanation allowed such interpretations to persist within oral tradition. Over time, these associations became part of the vessel's evolving narrative identity. Speculative dockside conversations recorded through indirect accounts introduced suggestions of illicit cargo or smuggling activity, though none were supported by inspection evidence. Such interpretations often emerge in maritime contexts where unexplained behaviour or abandonment invites assumptions of hidden intent. The structure of these rumours typically reflects familiar patterns of suspicion rather than documented fact, relying on the idea that concealed activity must exist where no official explanation is provided. Within this framework, the Resolven became a vessel onto which broader expectations of secrecy were projected. Repeated oral transmission along western coastal communities preserved the idea of hidden passengers, even though no confirmation appeared in any formal record. This theme frequently appears in maritime folklore, particularly in cases involving abandoned ships or unexplained voyages, where absence of crew is interpreted through narrative reconstruction rather than verified evidence. In the Resolven accounts, the notion of concealed individuals functioned less as a claim and more as a structural response to unresolved absence. It provided a narrative mechanism to explain what documentation could not definitively resolve. Factual inspection details gradually shifted in meaning once removed from official documentation, becoming reorganized into broader speculative interpretations. Elements that were originally recorded as neutral observations acquired new significance, when placed into informal storytelling contexts, where they were reinterpreted through the lens of uncertainty. This transformation did not alter the original records themselves, but it changed how those records were understood within public discourse. The separation between documented observation and narrative reinterpretation widened as the story circulated further from its source. A widening separation between structured salvage reports and informal coastal narration became increasingly visible as the vessel transitioned from physical object to interpreted event. Official documentation remained fixed in procedural language, describing structural conditions and inspection outcomes without deviation. In contrast, coastal accounts evolved dynamically, absorbing new elements and discarding others depending on audience and context. This divergence created two parallel versions of the Resolven, one preserved in records, the other evolving through repetition. Repetition within community storytelling elevated unresolved features such as the sealed compartment into central narrative focus, far beyond their documented significance. In structured reports, such features were treated as procedural notes or incomplete inspections, but in oral accounts they became focal points for speculation. The act of repetition itself reinforced their importance, regardless of their original role in the investigation. Through this process, minor uncertainties expanded into defining elements of the broader narrative. Successive retelling cycles across coastal settlements redistributed emphasis across the story unevenly, amplifying certain details while erasing others entirely. This pattern of a narrative drift is common in orally transmitted accounts, where memory and emphasis are shaped by social reinforcement rather than fixed documentation. In the case of the Resolven, each retelling subtly altered the balance between what was remembered and what was omitted. Over time, these shifts produced multiple overlapping versions of the same incident, none of which fully aligned with the original records. Maritime speculation replacing formal record-keeping allowed multiple conflicting versions of the incident to persist simultaneously without any resolution mechanism. In environments where official clarification is absent or delayed, informal interpretation often fills the resulting gap. The Resolven became subject to this process as its documented findings remained confined to salvage reports, while public discussion continued independently. This separation allowed contradiction to persist without correction, reinforcing the fragmented nature of the vessel's post-discovery identity. Regional memory of the Resolven eventually fragmented into overlapping narrative interpretations rather than a single, coherent account, shaped entirely by repetition and omission. What remained consistent across versions was not factual precision, but the presence of uncertainty itself. The vessel existed simultaneously as a documented case, a rumoured mystery, and a symbolic maritime anomaly depending on the context in which it was discussed. This multiplicity prevented any single interpretation from becoming definitive within coastal discourse. Unanswered portions of official crew testimony drew increasing attention among coastal listeners who had never encountered the ship directly, shifting focus away from the vessel itself. As interest moved further from physical evidence, emphasis began to concentrate on the gaps within recorded statements rather than their content. These omissions became the primary subject of discussion, interpreted as meaningful in their own right despite lacking explicit explanation. In this way, absence within testimony became more influential than testimony itself. Questions left unresolved during official inquiry began to centre increasingly on what the surviving crew chose not to say at all. What the crew refused to tell authorities. Official inquiry records show that the initial examination of the Resolven survivors followed established maritime procedures designed to reconstruct events through sequential, individual testimony. These procedures were standard practice within 19th century maritime governance, particularly in cases involving abandoned or recovered vessels, where investigators relied heavily on structured questioning to separate memory from influence. Each sailor was interviewed independently, with responses recorded in written logs intended to preserve accuracy across multiple stages of review. The process was designed not to interpret events immediately, but to establish a stable foundation of facts from which later conclusions could be drawn. In theory, this method reduced ambiguity. In practice, it often revealed the limits of human recollection under stress. During formal questioning sessions, surviving crew members were separated to prevent cross-contamination of accounts, a standard practice in 19th century maritime investigations. This separation ensured that each testimony reflected individual memory rather than collective reconstruction, influenced by shared discussion. Investigators conducted interviews in controlled conditions, often repeating similar questions across different sessions to identify inconsistencies or confirmation patterns. In the case of the Resolven, this repetition produced results that were initially coherent, suggesting a shared understanding of the voyage's final stages. However, coherence at the surface level did not persist uniformly as questioning continued over time. Transcript documentation reveals that early statements provided by the sailors maintained a broadly consistent outline of events, before gradually diverging in later interviews. Initial accounts described standard voyage conditions, routine operations aboard the vessel, and general maritime activity consistent with expected Atlantic passage behaviour. Yet as questioning progressed, subtle variations emerged in the sequence of events and in the description of specific onboard conditions. These variations were not immediately dramatic, but they accumulated across multiple interviews, creating divergence where continuity had first appeared. The shift was gradual enough that it did not initially trigger procedural concern, but it became more significant when viewed in aggregate. Repeated examination of crew statements highlights a pattern in which certain details were offered once, then omitted entirely in subsequent questioning cycles. This phenomenon is not uncommon in maritime testimony, where memory can shift under repeated recall, but in the Resolven inquiry it appeared concentrated around specific areas of the vessel and particular moments of the voyage. Some details were clearly articulated in early interviews but were absent in later ones without explanation or correction. The absence was not always accompanied by contradiction, but rather by silence, where previously mentioned elements simply ceased to appear in the narrative. Over time, these omissions became as significant as the statements themselves. Maritime investigative procedures indicate that official logs from the inquiry contain notable gaps, particularly in sections where witness testimony was expected to be recorded in full. These gaps do not necessarily indicate procedural failure, but they do complicate efforts to reconstruct a complete timeline of events aboard the Resolven. In several instances, entries reference interviews without preserving full transcripts, instead summarizing responses in condensed form. This practice was not unusual for the period, especially when documentation resources were limited or when investigators prioritized summary over verbatim record. Nevertheless, the absence of full detail contributes to the difficulty of establishing a continuous narrative. Recorded inconsistencies within testimony become more apparent when comparing timelines provided by different crew members regarding the sequence of abandonment. While all accounts agree that the vessel was ultimately left at sea without structural failure, the timing and progression of that decision vary between individuals. Some testimonies suggest a gradual withdrawal from operations, while others imply a more abrupt departure from standard procedure. These differences are not easily reconciled within a single explanatory framework, particularly given the absence of physical evidence indicating forced evacuation. The result is a set of overlapping timelines that cannot be fully aligned. Inquiry archives from the Resolven case show that no unified account could be established regarding the exact moment the crew decided to leave the vessel. Despite repeated attempts to isolate this decision point through structured questioning, responses remained inconsistent or incomplete. Some sailors described conditions leading up to abandonment, while others refused to define a specific moment at all, instead referencing a general state of uncertainty. The absence of a clear decision point creates a structural gap in the investigative record, where cause and effect cannot be precisely ordered. This gap remains unresolved within the official archive. Questioning records demonstrate that sailors frequently avoided elaboration when asked to describe conditions below deck during the final hours aboard the ship. These responses were often brief, sometimes redirecting attention to other areas of the vessel or to general descriptions of surface-level conditions. The consistency of this avoidance across multiple interviews suggests that it was not isolated to individual hesitation, but may have reflected a broader reluctance to engage with specific topics. However, the records do not provide explicit explanation for this pattern, leaving interpretation open within the limits of documented evidence. Across multiple interrogation sessions, references to specific areas of the vessel were consistently met with shortened responses or deliberate topic shifts. Investigators noted that when certain sections of the ship were mentioned, particularly those located below the main deck, crew members tended to redirect their answers toward more general or unrelated aspects of the voyage. This pattern was not formally categorized as refusal, but it was recorded as a recurring feature of testimony behavior. The repetition of this response style across different individuals suggests a shared reluctance, though its origin remains undocumented. Maritime investigators noted that certain lines of questioning produced increasing resistance from witnesses, particularly when revisiting previously answered subjects. This resistance did not always manifest as overt refusal. In many cases, it appeared as reduced detail, shorter responses, or a shift in tone. Over successive interviews, the level of elaboration decreased in some areas while remaining stable in others, creating uneven depth across different aspects of the testimony. The reasons for this variation were not determined during the inquiry process, and no formal conclusion was recorded regarding its cause. Testimony comparisons suggest that while surface-level details remained stable, underlying explanations for actions taken aboard the vessel were never fully articulated. Crew members consistently agreed on general conditions of the voyage, but diverged when asked to explain motivations or decision-making processes. This separation between observable events and interpretive explanation created a persistent gap within the record. In maritime investigation, such gaps are particularly significant because they prevent the reconstruction of intent, which is often essential for understanding sequence and causality. Inquiry documentation also records that some responses were truncated before completion, leaving interpretive gaps in the official transcripts. These incomplete statements appear in multiple sections of the archive, often without annotation or clarification regarding why the testimony was interrupted. While some truncations may be attributed to procedural recording methods, others suggest that answers were not fully provided during questioning. The absence of complete responses introduces uncertainty into the record, particularly when those statements relate to critical phases of the voyage. Investigative review of the collected statements indicates that no single witness provided a continuous, uninterrupted narrative of the entire incident. Instead, each account contains segments of information that align with others in certain areas, but diverge in structure, sequence, or emphasis elsewhere. This fragmentation makes it difficult to construct a singular cohesive timeline from testimony alone. While overlap exists in general descriptions, continuity breaks down when attempting to align detailed sequences of events across all witnesses. Procedural analysis of the inquiry process shows that repeated questioning sessions did not resolve contradictions, but instead introduced additional variations in phrasing and detail. As interviews progressed, some answers became more refined, while others became more generalized, resulting in shifting levels of specificity across different sessions. This dynamic is not uncommon in extended interrogations, where memory reconstruction can be influenced by repetition and reflection. However, in the Resolven case, it contributed to increasing complexity rather than clarification. Official records emphasize that despite extensive examination, no clear operational cause for the crew's abandonment of the Resolven could be established through testimony alone. The vessel itself remained structurally intact, and no external damage was identified that would account for evacuation under standard maritime conditions. This disconnect between physical evidence and human explanation defines the central limitation of the inquiry. Without corroborating structural failure or environmental catastrophe, testimony alone could not resolve the underlying cause of abandonment. Behavioral notes appended to the inquiry files describe moments of hesitation and reluctance among crew members when certain topics were introduced. These annotations were not part of the formal testimony, but were included as supplementary observations by investigators conducting the interviews. In several cases, responses appeared to slow or shorten when specific areas of the vessel were referenced, though no explicit refusal was recorded. These behavioral indicators were noted but not formally interpreted within the final report. Cross-referencing all available statements reveals a persistent absence of explanation regarding the conditions that prompted the evacuation decision. While individual accounts provide partial descriptions of events aboard the vessel, none fully articulate the reasoning behind the crew's collective action. This absence is consistent across multiple sources and remains unresolved within the archival record. The gap is not due to contradiction alone, but to the repeated omission of explanatory detail across otherwise detailed testimonies. As the inquiry formally concluded without resolution, analytical attention gradually shifted away from testimony and towards structural interpretations of the vessel's condition and circumstances. With human accounts unable to provide a complete explanation, investigators increasingly relied on physical evidence and environmental reconstruction to explore alternative frameworks. This transition marked a shift from witness-based inquiry to analytical speculation grounded in material observation. The unresolved nature of testimony became one of the defining features of the case, shaping how subsequent interpretations would be formed. What the surviving records failed to contain became as significant as the statements they preserved. Theories buried beneath the waterline. Subsequent analytical reviews of the Resolven case suggest that post-inquiry interpretation shifted away from direct testimony and toward layered theoretical reconstruction once official investigation efforts concluded. With no definitive cause established through salvage records or survivor statements, later examinations began treating the incident less as a single unresolved event and more as a convergence point for multiple competing explanatory frameworks. This transition marked a shift in focus from what was observed aboard the vessel to what could be inferred from the absence of complete documentation. In this stage of analysis, the Resolven ceased to function as a purely historical case and instead became a reference point for broader interpretive models in maritime studies. Later interpretive models proposed by maritime researchers examining abandoned vessels frequently begin with environmental contamination scenarios, particularly those involving deteriorating cargo in enclosed holds during extended sea exposure. Such conditions were historically known to produce hazardous atmospheric changes in poorly ventilated sections of merchant ships, especially when organic or chemical materials were stored without adequate separation. In theoretical application to the Resolven, this framework attempts to account for sudden crew evacuation without visible structural damage. However, the absence of verified cargo evidence in surviving manifests prevents this model from achieving full evidentiary support, leaving it as a plausible but unconfirmed explanation. Theoretical examinations of 19th century merchant shipping incidents often include the possibility of toxic fumes generated by improperly stored materials, though no verified cargo manifest from the Resolven supports such a conclusion. In maritime operations of the period, cargo misclassification or undocumented storage was not unknown, particularly during long voyages involving multiple ports of call. Analytical models suggest that such conditions could produce disorientation or acute distress among crew members under confined atmospheric exposure. Yet in the case of the Resolven, no physical residue or documented material irregularity was recorded during salvage inspection, creating a gap between theoretical possibility and recorded evidence. Comparative psychological analyses of long-duration sea voyages propose that extreme isolation, sleep deprivation, and sensory monotony may contribute to perceptual distortion among crew members under sustained maritime stress. Historical accounts of extended voyages frequently reference altered perception, fatigue-induced misjudgment, and heightened sensitivity to environmental stimuli during prolonged periods at sea. Applied retrospectively to the Resolven, this framework considers whether cumulative psychological strain could account for inconsistent testimony and abrupt abandonment behaviour. However, while such conditions are well documented in maritime history, they do not independently explain the absence of structural or environmental triggers recorded in the vessel's inspection. Within reconstructed mutiny frameworks discussed in historical maritime literature, investigators sometimes consider internal conflict scenarios, even when physical evidence fails to indicate structural damage consistent with violent confrontation. Mutiny models typically rely on indicators such as physical disturbance, weapon-related evidence, or disruption of vessel systems, none of which were conclusively identified aboard the Resolven. Nevertheless, theoretical application of this framework explores whether non-physical coercion or psychological breakdown could account for coordinated abandonment without visible struggle. The limitation of this interpretation lies in the absence of corroborating physical or testimonial continuity across surviving crew accounts. Alternative explanatory frameworks involving illicit maritime activity suggest that smuggling operations could account for sudden abandonment events, although such models remain unsupported by the documented inspection records of the vessel. In historical maritime contexts, concealed cargo or unauthorized transport occasionally led to emergency evacuation or deliberate vessel abandonment when exposure became imminent. When applied to the Resolven, this theory attempts to explain inconsistencies in testimony as deliberate obfuscation. However, the lack of contraband evidence or irregular cargo documentation significantly weakens this interpretation, within the official investigative record. Some post-analysis interpretations introduce the concept of concealed individuals aboard merchant ships, drawing from broader historical patterns of undocumented stowaways in 19th century transatlantic travel. Such cases are documented in maritime history, particularly in vessels operating extended routes where access control could be inconsistent during loading operations. In theoretical application to the Resolven, this model suggests that unrecorded presence aboard the ship could account for behavioural anomalies and incomplete testimony. Yet no physical or documentary evidence confirms additional individuals beyond the recorded crew, leaving the hypothesis speculative within the bounds of available records. Maritime folklore referenced in comparative studies of ghost vessel narratives frequently frames abandoned ships as entities influenced by superstition, environmental misfortune, or culturally inherited maritime symbolism rather than identifiable mechanical causes. These interpretations often emerge in coastal traditions where unexplained loss at sea becomes integrated into broader narrative structures of warning and symbolism. In analytical comparison, the Resolven is occasionally positioned alongside such narratives due to its unresolved abandonment and fragmented testimony. However, folklore-based explanations operate outside empirical verification and therefore remain interpretive rather than evidentiary in nature. Structural failure hypotheses examined in technical reviews of the Resolven are generally considered inconsistent with recorded salvage findings, which describe the vessel as intact and seaworthy at the time of discovery. Maritime structural failure typically presents identifiable markers such as hull breach, mass collapse, or systemic mechanical degradation, none of which were reported during inspection. The absence of such indicators significantly limits the viability of this explanatory model. As a result, structural failure remains largely excluded from primary analytical conclusions regarding the vessel's abandonment. Combined interpretive models attempting to reconcile multiple theories often acknowledge the absence of a singular explanatory mechanism capable of aligning testimony, physical evidence, and recorded timelines. These hybrid approaches propose that multiple low-level factors may have interacted to produce a cumulative effect, rather than a single identifiable cause. In the case of the Resolven, such models attempt to bridge gaps between psychological, environmental, and procedural explanations. However, without direct evidence linking these factors, the combined framework remains structurally incomplete. No single analytical framework proposed in subsequent evaluations fully accounts for the simultaneous presence of intact ship conditions, fragmented testimony, and unresolved inspection gaps within the archival record. This triad of conditions forms the central challenge of interpretation, as each proposed theory resolves one aspect while failing to address others. The persistence of this imbalance has led some researchers to treat the case as structurally resistant to singular explanation. In this view, the Resolven is not defined by what is known, but by the incompatibility of its recorded elements. Cross-disciplinary comparisons with similar maritime abandonment cases reveal recurring patterns of incomplete explanation, though none replicate the specific combination of conditions documented in the Resolven incident. Other historical cases often involve either confirmed structural damage, environmental catastrophe, or documented mutiny, each providing at least partial resolution. The Resolven, however, presents a convergence of intact physical conditions and unresolved human testimony that resists categorization. This distinction has led to its continued analytical interest within maritime historical studies. Within post-investigation literature on the case, emphasis increasingly shifts from identifying a definitive cause toward categorizing the structural limits of available evidence. This methodological transition reflects a broader recognition that some maritime incidents may be defined more by evidentiary absence than by reconstructible events. In this context, the Resolven serves as a case study in the boundaries of historical inference. The focus therefore moves from explanation toward understanding why explanation itself remains unattainable within the existing record. Extended analytical reviews eventually converge on the recognition that each proposed theory collapses at the point where documented records cease to provide corroboration, leaving interpretive models inherently incomplete. This collapse does not occur due to contradiction alone, but due to the consistent absence of verifying material across all frameworks. As a result, each theory remains partially plausible, yet ultimately insufficient. The cumulative effect is not resolution, but reinforced uncertainty across all interpretive approaches. The accumulation of competing explanations produces an analytical saturation point in which additional theories no longer clarify the incident, but instead reinforce the absence of resolution at its core. At this stage of review, explanatory models begin to function as reflections of investigative limitation rather than as pathways toward conclusion. The Resolven becomes less a subject of explanation and more an illustration of the limits of explanation itself. This saturation marks a transition from investigation to recognition of interpretive boundary. Across all examined frameworks, the unresolved element remains consistent in its absence rather than its definition, appearing only through the gaps it leaves in otherwise structured interpretations. This absence is not localized to a single component of the case, but distributed across testimony, physical inspection, and procedural documentation alike. It functions as a structural constant within every attempted explanation, resisting incorporation into any unified model. In this sense, the missing element is defined only by its repeated failure to be identified. Reassessment of the Resolven through theoretical comparison ultimately highlights that explanation itself becomes unstable when applied to a case defined by incomplete testimony and intact physical evidence. The vessel presents a condition in which all necessary components for resolution exist in isolation, but cannot be assembled into a coherent whole. This instability affects not only individual theories but the framework of interpretation itself. As a result, the case remains suspended between what is observed and what cannot be conclusively determined. As analytical focus transitions beyond competing theories, attention begins to shift toward the enduring effects of unresolved maritime incidents once they move beyond the boundaries of investigation. At this stage, the Resolven is no longer confined to the domain of maritime inquiry, but enters a broader space where its influence is shaped by memory, retelling, and interpretation beyond formal records. The subject of study becomes less the vessel itself, and more the persistence of its unresolved condition across different contexts of understanding. The consequences of unresolved inquiry begin to surface not within the ship's history, but in the accounts carried ashore by those who encountered its aftermath. The ship that carried its fear ashore. Following return to coastal ports after the recovery of the Resolven, surviving crew members were reintegrated into maritime communities where their presence was recorded, but their experiences remained largely unspoken. The transition from shipboard isolation back into structured port life occurred through standard maritime procedures of the period, where sailors were typically reassigned, medically assessed if required, and gradually returned to labour networks tied to shipping routes. In this case, however, administrative continuity did not appear to extend into narrative continuity, as official records document their return without preserving any sustained account of their shared experience aboard the vessel. What was physically reintegrated into port infrastructure did not appear to translate into communicative reintegration among the men themselves. Their return, while procedurally complete, introduced an absence within the social record that would later become increasingly noticeable in retrospective accounts. In accounts describing post-voyage behaviour among the recovered sailors, a consistent pattern emerges in which direct references to the incident were avoided entirely in informal and professional settings alike. Observational records preserved through port correspondence and secondary maritime documentation suggest that conversations involving the Resolven were either redirected or concluded abruptly when introduced. This avoidance did not manifest as formal prohibition, but rather as a behavioural pattern, distributed across multiple individuals in separate locations. The consistency of this pattern across different environments suggests that it was not dependent on a single authority or external instruction, but instead reflected a shared reluctance embedded within the group's post-return conduct. Over time, this absence of discussion became as defining as the original event itself. Maritime employment records from the period indicate that several crew members discontinued seafaring work shortly after their return, despite having no documented injuries that would typically prevent continued service. In standard maritime practice, sailors often returned to employment relatively quickly, following voyages unless physical incapacity or disciplinary action intervened. The departure of experienced crew members from active service therefore appears as an irregularity within the employment continuity expected of the period. While official records do not provide explicit reasoning for these departures, the timing closely follows their reintegration after the Resolven incident. This temporal proximity has led later analysts to note the pattern, though no causal explanation is recorded within the primary documentation. Reports concerning returning sailors suggest noticeable changes in social engagement within port communities, where individuals who had once participated in routine dockside interaction became increasingly withdrawn. These changes were not formally classified within medical or psychological frameworks of the time, but they were observed indirectly through correspondence, labour notes, and community-level accounts. In several ports, individuals previously known for active participation in maritime exchanges were later described as minimising contact or limiting interaction to essential transactions only. The shift in behaviour did not occur uniformly, but its recurrence across multiple accounts suggests a broader pattern of social disengagement following the voyage. No official mechanism was recorded to account for this change in behaviour. Observations recorded in port communities describe a gradual reduction in verbal exchange related to the voyage, with conversations shifting away from the Resolven even when indirectly referenced. In environments where maritime events were commonly discussed as part of daily life, this reduction stands out not as sudden silence, but as a progressive narrowing of acceptable subject matter. Dockside communication, typically characterised by frequent storytelling and exchange of recent maritime experiences, appears to have excluded sustained reference to this specific incident. The absence of discussion was not enforced through formal restriction, yet it persisted across different locations and social settings. Over time, this absence became part of the observable pattern associated with the returning crew. After disembarkation from the Resolven, surviving sailors were subject to routine questioning by maritime authorities, yet their responses contained little additional detail beyond what had already been formally documented. Standard procedure involved follow-up interviews designed to clarify inconsistencies and expand upon initial statements, particularly in cases involving abandoned or recovered vessels. However, in this instance, recorded responses remained largely consistent with earlier testimony, offering no substantial elaboration or new reconstruction of events. The lack of expansion in later questioning sessions contributed to the persistence of unresolved gaps within the official record. These gaps remained unchanged despite procedural repetition. Historical patterns of maritime service show that prolonged exposure to uncertain or unresolved sea incidents can lead to long-term behavioural shifts among sailors, particularly in cases where events remain unexplainable within official records. While such patterns are not universal, maritime labour history contains documented instances where individuals altered occupational trajectories following experiences involving ambiguity or unexplained abandonment at sea. In analytical comparison, the Resolven case aligns with this broader category in terms of post-incident behavioural change, though it remains distinct in its combination of intact vessel condition and incomplete testimony. This distinction prevents direct equivalence, but supports broader contextual interpretation within maritime behavioural studies. Within the weeks following their return, several crew members were noted to have severed regular ties with established shipping routes, effectively removing themselves from familiar occupational networks. Maritime labour systems of the period relied heavily on recurring participation in known routes and port connections, making such withdrawal notable within employment continuity records. The absence of these individuals from expected rotations suggests a break not only in employment but in routine maritime engagement. While records confirm their disappearance from active service listings, no formal explanation accompanies their removal from these networks. The silence within administrative documentation mirrors the silence observed in their testimony. In localised port accounts preserved through administrative correspondence, returning sailors were often described as present but disengaged, participating minimally in discussions unrelated to their prior voyage. This characterization appears repeatedly across different coastal locations, suggesting a consistent observational pattern rather than isolated anecdote. The distinction between physical presence and social participation becomes a recurring feature in descriptions of their post-return behaviour. While they remained within maritime environments, their interaction with those environments appears reduced in scope and intensity. This partial withdrawal contributed to their gradual separation from collective maritime discourse. Maritime documentation from coastal employment registries reflects a gradual absence of former crew members from active shipping rosters, though no singular cause is recorded for their departure from service. The administrative records maintain procedural neutrality, listing changes in employment status without contextual explanation. In cases where explanations are typically provided, such as injury or reassignment, no corresponding annotations appear for these individuals. The absence of recorded justification introduces an informational gap within otherwise complete employment tracking systems. This gap persists across multiple entries associated with the Resolven crew. Across multiple coastal settlements, informal observations indicate that references to the Resolven diminished rapidly once the crew had dispersed, suggesting a decline in collective narrative reinforcement. Maritime communities often sustain discussion of notable incidents through repeated retelling among active sailors and dockside workers. In this case, however, the decline in reference frequency appears to coincide directly with the reduced visibility of the surviving crew. As those most closely associated with the vessel withdrew from maritime circulation, the incident itself appears to have receded from active conversational space. The relationship between presence and narrative persistence becomes increasingly apparent in this pattern. Behavioural continuity among surviving sailors appears fragmented when examined across different ports of residence, with no unified pattern of communication or shared recollection evident after separation. While initial accounts suggest a shared experience aboard the vessel, later behavioural records indicate no sustained coordination in how that experience was referenced or avoided. Each individual appears to have maintained an independent trajectory following return, with no documented effort to consolidate or collectively recount the incident. This fragmentation contrasts with the initial expectation that shared maritime experience would produce continued narrative cohesion. Instead, dispersion appears to have accelerated narrative dissolution. Institutional records from maritime authorities show a marked reduction in follow-up inquiries once initial investigations were concluded, effectively limiting further structured engagement with the crew. Standard investigative practice typically involves extended review when cases remain unresolved. Yet in this instance, documentation indicates a relatively contained closure of official inquiry procedures. The absence of sustained institutional engagement contributed to the gradual withdrawal of the case from active administrative focus. Without continued procedural reinforcement, the incident transitioned into archival status rather than ongoing investigation. This shift marks a formal boundary between inquiry and historical record. Over time, surviving sailors became increasingly absent from maritime discourse within their respective communities, with little documentation of continued participation in sea-related discussion or activity. This absence is not recorded as disappearance, but rather as gradual non-participation in contexts where their experience would have once been relevant. The reduction in their visibility within maritime dialogue suggests a long-term disengagement from collective narrative structures. While their physical presence in coastal regions is intermittently documented, their experiential presence within maritime storytelling effectively diminishes. This separation between existence and narrative relevance becomes increasingly pronounced in later records. In broader observational records of port life, the absence of discussion regarding the Resolven among those most directly connected to it became a notable feature in itself rather than a simple omission. Maritime communities typically preserve and circulate accounts of unusual incidents, particularly those involving recovered vessels or unexplained abandonment. The absence of such circulation in this case stands out as an irregularity within expected communicative behaviour. Rather than fading through repetition, the story appears to have withdrawn through non-repetition among its primary carriers. This inversion of typical narrative persistence distinguishes the case within maritime observational studies. Some accounts suggest that returning sailors maintained routine physical presence in coastal regions, while remaining disengaged from maritime identity, effectively separating occupation from lived experience. This separation is reflected in descriptions that distinguish between physical location and participatory engagement within maritime culture. Individuals remained geographically situated within port environments, yet appeared functionally detached from their interpretive frameworks. The result is a condition in which presence does not equate to narrative participation. This distinction becomes increasingly relevant in understanding the post-return phase of the crew's documented behaviour. As years passed following the incident, references to the voyage ceased to appear even in contexts where maritime history was actively discussed, indicating a progressive erosion of narrative transmission. In archival comparisons, this decline is not immediate but gradual, occurring across multiple stages of documentation and oral history. The absence becomes more pronounced over time, suggesting not a single moment of forgetting, but a sustained reduction in communicative reinforcement. Within this process, the Resolven shifts from an active subject of discussion to a historical reference point with diminishing presence. This transition reflects broader patterns of narrative decay in maritime cultural records. Eventually, both formal records and informal recollections converge on a shared absence of continued reference to the Resolven among its surviving crew, marking the final observable point of collective disengagement. This convergence is significant not because it resolves the incident, but because it standardizes the absence of further information across independent documentation systems. Both administrative and communal records reach a similar endpoint in which no additional narrative development is recorded. The alignment of these separate domains reinforces the conclusion that the story ceased to evolve within observable channels. What remains is not explanation, but cessation of reference. In the absence of further testimony or reference, the vessel itself began to fade not only from records, but from the memory of those who had once been closest to its final voyage. The final disappearance of the Resolven. Archival records relating to the Resolven show that its initial documentation remained intact for a limited period following the inquiry, preserved within standard maritime registries of the era before subsequent consolidation efforts altered its visibility. In the earlier stages after the vessel's recovery and formal examination, the case existed as a complete administrative file, containing structured references to salvage reports, survivor testimony summaries, and procedural notes from maritime authorities. These materials were treated in accordance with conventional record-keeping practices of 19th century shipping governance, where incidents were catalogued for reference in navigation safety, insurance review, and institutional learning. At that point in its existence within official systems, the Resolven was not an anomaly in archival terms, but a concluded case among many recorded maritime events of the period. In later maritime documentation, references to the case appear increasingly sparse, with only brief acknowledgements of the vessel's recovery surviving in summary records rather than detailed investigative files. As maritime record systems evolved, and older case files were condensed into broader historical compilations, the Resolven gradually shifted from a fully documented incident to a referenced entry within larger registries. This transition did not occur abruptly, but through incremental reduction of detail, where entire sections of original documentation were omitted in favour of condensed notations. Over time, the richness of the original inquiry was replaced by abbreviated mention, reflecting broader administrative practices rather than any single act of removal or suppression. Subsequent registry updates failed to include comprehensive cross-references to earlier inquiry materials, resulting in a gradual separation between primary documentation and later institutional summaries. This separation created a structural discontinuity within the archival chain, where earlier detailed reports no longer directly connected to later compiled references. In practical terms, the Resolven case ceased to exist as a continuous file, and instead became distributed across different layers of maritime record systems. Each layer preserved a fragment of the original case, but no single layer retained the full investigative structure. The result was not disappearance in a literal sense, but fragmentation across time and administrative revision. Preserved maritime archives contain fragmented entries on the Resolven, distributed across multiple record systems, rather than maintained as a single unified file, reflecting the administrative structure of historical shipping records. These fragments include salvage notations, brief inquiry summaries, and isolated references to crew testimony, each existing independently within separate archival classifications. When viewed collectively, they suggest the outline of a fully documented case, yet no surviving system retains all components in a connected form. This fragmentation complicates efforts to reconstruct the original investigative narrative, as each surviving piece exists without the full context once provided by the complete file. Comparative cataloguing of historical shipping incidents indicates that cases lacking definitive conclusions often experience diminished archival reinforcement over time, particularly when no further investigative action is recorded. In maritime administrative practice, unresolved or static cases are typically revisited only when new evidence emerges, which did not occur in the Resolven case. As a result, the file was neither expanded nor corrected, leaving it to gradually settle into archival stability without renewed engagement. This process reflects a broader pattern in institutional record systems, where inactive cases lose prominence not through deletion, but through procedural absence of continuation. Later stages of maritime record consolidation show the Resolven appearing only intermittently within indexed references, often without accompanying contextual explanation. In these instances, the vessel is listed as part of broader historical datasets, where individual case detail is no longer prioritized. The absence of contextual expansion reduces the incident to a reference point rather than a narrative record. Within this reduced format, the Resolven exists primarily as a marker of past documentation, rather than a fully accessible case study. Subsequent documentation confirms no addition of new evidence or revised testimony related to the incident, reinforcing the static nature of the case following its initial investigative closure. After the conclusion of the original inquiry, no additional maritime reports or survivor statements were formally integrated into the archival record. This absence of supplementary material meant that the case remained fixed at its final documented stage. In archival terms, it became a closed record without subsequent revision or reinterpretation within official systems. Extended archival reviews reveal that references to the crew's statements become increasingly indirect over time, appearing primarily through secondary citations rather than original transcripts. Where initial documentation preserved direct testimony summaries, later records refer only to their existence rather than reproducing their content. This shift indicates not only loss of detail, but a transition in how the case is accessed within institutional memory. The original voices of the crew, once embedded in structured reports, become increasingly mediated through layers of reference. Administrative preservation records suggest that portions of the original inquiry files were not recatalogued during later system updates, contributing to uneven accessibility across archival collections. This does not imply deliberate exclusion, but rather reflects the procedural limitations of large-scale record migration processes. During such transitions, some materials are prioritized for integration, while others remain in legacy storage systems. As a result, the completeness of access to the Resolven file varies depending on archival pathway rather than original documentation integrity. Cross-referenced maritime databases show no unified retention of the complete Resolven file across institutional repositories, indicating structural fragmentation in historical preservation. Different archives preserve different segments of the case, often without synchronization between systems. This lack of unified structure means that no single repository offers a complete reconstruction of the inquiry. Instead, researchers must rely on partial overlaps between fragmented sources, each representing only a portion of the original record. At advanced stages of maritime indexing, the incident is reduced to brief notation entries without accompanying narrative detail, effectively limiting interpretive continuity. In these condensed formats, the Resolven appears only as a line item within broader catalogues of maritime history. The absence of narrative context removes temporal and procedural depth from the entry, leaving only minimal identification markers. This reduction reflects a broader archival tendency to compress historical incidents into searchable identifiers rather than detailed accounts. Maritime literature compilations in subsequent years do not expand upon the case, despite continued inclusion of other contemporaneous incidents within similar historical records. While other maritime events of the same era receive ongoing commentary or reinterpretation in later publications, the Resolven remains largely static in its representation. This absence of expansion contributes to its gradual separation from active historical discourse. Over time, it exists less as a subject of study and more as a reference that is no longer developed further. Institutional summaries of historical shipping events occasionally list the Resolven without elaboration, suggesting a shift from narrative case study to minimal reference status. In these summaries, the vessel is acknowledged but not explored, appearing alongside other resolved or inactive cases. The lack of elaboration indicates that the incident has moved beyond the scope of active analytical consideration. What remains is a formal acknowledgement of existence without accompanying interpretive detail. Final stages of documented archival transition show the case ceasing to appear in extended analytical discussions of maritime incidents, remaining only in isolated historical listings. At this point, the Resolven is no longer part of interpretive frameworks used in maritime analysis or historical synthesis. its presence is confined to catalogue entries rather than analytical discourse. This final reduction marks the end of its functional role within maritime historiography. The structural gap between early comprehensive records and later minimal references becomes more pronounced over time, highlighting the absence of continuous documentation linkage. This gap is not the result of a single omission, but of cumulative reduction across multiple stages of archival management. As earlier materials lose direct connection to later references, continuity breaks down into isolated segments. The case becomes increasingly defined by discontinuity rather than progression. Historical record evaluations do not identify the precise moment at which the narrative record of the incident ceased to expand, leaving the transition into archival silence undefined. This lack of identifiable cutoff point contributes to the ambiguity surrounding the case's archival trajectory. Rather than a clear termination, the record appears to taper gradually into absence. The absence of a defined endpoint reinforces the perception of gradual disappearance within institutional memory. Retrospective assessments of maritime documentation practices frequently cite the Resolven as an example of incomplete archival continuity rather than unresolved investigative content, emphasizing documentation loss over interpretive ambiguity. In this framing, the case is not treated as a mystery awaiting explanation, but as a record affected by structural limitations of preservation system.